The apostles are those who stand at the top of the world, collectively known as the 12 supernatural beings. The story goes that each of the apostles, dressed in a blue cloak with a deep hood, was incredibly strong. Some could control water volumes comparable to the oceans. Others confronted entire human empires. Moreover, they could create new worlds from their own flesh and blood, cradling them in their arms like babies. Among them is the most powerful apostle named Yulman, who has unlimited power. According to records, his fighting power far surpasses that of other apostles, but its origin is unknown. The highest category of danger is designated as an apostle, but when the apostles themselves disappeared, they gradually began to be forgotten, remembered only in legends. A dark-haired guy dressed in a formal suit and cape sneezed loudly. Scratching his nose, he looked back at the icy mountains with snowcaps surrounding him and thought with displeasure that soldiers would come to this cold as soon as possible and fight this small dragon. Ice Dragon Warcraft, Category Disaster. The most dangerous category in the existing classification of Warcraft has great destructive power. The brunette watched as the Ice Dragon led the various monsters of the north into the Thunderfield. In order to protect national security, the Empire of Guam immediately deployed its troops to defend. This battle will begin soon. The human warriors talked among themselves. Some asked whether their temporary detachment would be able to win. Others answered that only God knew the answer to this question. Finally, a cry was heard from a warrior at the front, which started the battle. The armored men, waving swords in one hand and holding shields in the other, rushed towards the army of monsters, led by the Ice Dragon with a roar. Huge giants brought down the power of their fists on them. Raising his head and opening his mouth in surprise, the knight watched as birds of prey flew down on him from above with a deafening roar. The human army, like toy figures, flew away from the blows of the enemies. The dragon, with its red eyes flashing, crushed knights left and right with its sharp wings. The guy stood on a high slope and, seeing the squad running away in horror, muttered that these soldiers were not opponents of monsters. Thoughtfully putting his finger to his lips, he thought that the disparity in combat power was too great. Most likely, the humans would soon lose. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a red-haired stranger appeared on the battlefield, calling for no panic. The brunette looked around in surprise, hearing a girl's voice in the icy mountains. She continued her speech by saying that if the opponent is stronger, it does not mean that they are losing. Standing on the edge of the ice floe, she released a stream of fire straight from her palm upwards. If she retreated now, everything would definitely end in failure. Lowering her hand, the girl directed the fire straight towards the ice dragon. This fragile-looking stranger's name was Sierra Charlotte. One of the 4 great mages of the Guam Empire, known as the Fire Witch, was appointed to lead this army. The people came to life, joyfully exclaiming that now, thanks to Madame Sierra, they had a chance to win. Pointing her hand towards the monsters, Charlotte loudly gave the order to attack. With their fighting spirit raised, the knights rushed into the attack with renewed vigor. A snowstorm, immediately after the fiery stream, covered the dragon with a huge shaft, and when the snow settled, the predator's eyes narrowed dangerously. The dragon flapped its wings, roared, and rose up. The people turned around in shock, and Sierra, who attacked it with the magic attack Fire Blast, could not believe that it was still moving. The animal released a large ice ball from its mouth, to then, the next second, spew ice and snow onto the human army, burying the warriors alive within themselves, killing them on the spot. The dragon flapped its wings, and the ice figures broke into several pieces right in the air. The Fire Witch, gritting her teeth, watched helplessly as her army perished. Unable to bear it any longer, she took a running start and jumped down, right into the thick of things. Raising her fiery sword above herself, Sierra shouted that she, as a mage of the Guam Empire, would not allow the dragon to win. The monster turned towards the sound, its eyes flashing with rage. The girl's sword landed with a clang on the dragon's icy tail. Their gazes, full of fury, stared at each other. Each one, calling upon magic, attacked the enemy with his weapon. But they were unable to touch each other. Charlotte jumped up, saving herself from the ice attack. The girl landed confidently on the cold ground. She formed a circle of fire around herself, from which flaming arrows separated, ready to fly at the ice monster at any second. He, without wasting any time, released from within another frosty, deadly portion of the blizzard. The witch rushed forward with a furious cry, followed by her faithful arrows. The dragon opened its fanged mouth and spewed out a magical ice ball. All that was left was to watch as ice and fire rushed towards each other. The two elements clashed in battle with a deafening sound. But the dragon's power turned out to be many times stronger, and the ice floe broke the fiery circle. Sierra squealed, realizing she was trapped. The ice extinguished the flame in a matter of seconds and crushed the witch into an ice block. Charlotte fell into the snow with a dull thud. Wounded, she coughed and tried to turn over onto her stomach, but her body did not obey the girl. The knights watched the leader in shock. No one dared to come closer. One of the warriors began to wail in despair, asking what to do now, even if Lady Sierra had lost. Someone's sword landed on the ground with a clang. The knight stepped back, sobbing that he couldn't believe what he saw. He turned sharply and rushed out of the battlefield. They cannot win! The others looked after him with their mouths open. Realizing that there was no point in resisting, the entire company ran away after their comrade. Charlotte, still lying on the cold ground, stretched out her hands, trying to stop her fallen army. When she was able to sit up, she found herself completely alone in the middle of an icy desert. The girl's shoulders were shaking with anger, and somehow, throwing away the fiery sparks, the witch managed to get to her feet. With just her lips, she hissed words of hatred at the cowardly knights. Suddenly, behind her, she heard someone asking her why the witch didn't run away, since there was no chance of winning at all. Charlotte turned around sharply. Who dared to say such a thing? A guy stood in front of her, holding his hands in his trouser pockets and smiling smugly, introducing himself as a man who wanted to earn a few gold coins here. Leaning forward slightly, he repeated the question, still smiling. Sierra shook her head, replying that the word escape was never and never would be in her vocabulary. The stranger chuckled, pretending to cover his mouth with his hand. He said that although it was cute, they didn't have time to chat about it now. The witch had no intention of stopping the argument and defiantly asked what he was talking about, not seeing what was happening behind her back. Finally, she realized she had been distracted and turned around at the sound of flapping wings. At that very moment, the dragon opened its mouth and attacked its opponents with ice magic. Sierra had no choice but to cover her face with her hands helplessly. Now it was all over. But for some reason, after a few seconds, she realized that she was still alive and opened her eyes. Incredibly, the stranger literally held the monster with one hand, while the other remained in his pocket. The guy loudly exclaimed that the dragon was bothering him. A shadow passed over his face, suggesting that he was talking to a miss. The brunette casually threw the ice creature away from himself because a small creature like this dragon should calm down. Having fallen on his back, the enemy, still rolling on the ground, comically began to wave his paws in the air. He couldn't understand what had happened a minute ago. While being towed, he regained his balance and turned over, clawing at the ground. The dragon seemed to have doubled in size after its absurd defeat, bristling and now looking down at its tiny enemy. The stranger extended his hand, gathering his magic together. He smirked and said that it looked like he had encountered a naughty dragon, while purple magic runes formed on his palm. The red eyes gleamed dangerously. Unfortunately for the dragon, he would soon be burned. It seemed that the monster had never encountered anything like this before, and looked at the guy in bewilderment. Sierra couldn't believe her eyes. A purple vortex emanating from the palm of the skinny stranger was spinning the dragon around like a rag doll. Finally, the raging magical hurricane hid the enemy's enormous figure from view. When the purple haze cleared, a beautiful blue crystal remained in the air. It landed right in the brunette's palm. He threw the stone into the air, turned around and asked the witch if she would go on a date with him at the expense of the life she had saved. The girl dropped to her knees and pressed her left hand to the wound on her right forearm. This impudent fellow was able to kill a disaster category monster with one movement. She felt something ringing in her head and her eyes closing. Charlotte only had time to ask who he was before she fell back unconscious. She was immediately picked up in the arms of a sudden savior. Leaning over the girl, he said with a smile that he was a simple mercenary who decided to earn some gold coins. Yulman, the first among the apostles, nicknamed Limitless. Everything that was happening flashed before my eyes as if through a veil, a purple whirlwind in which the ice dragon met his death. The stranger looked over his shoulder with a caustic grin, tossing a crystal in his palm. Sierra's eyes widened in horror. Sitting up abruptly in bed, she screamed and reached out her hand for the ice dragon. "We must catch and kill it." But suddenly the realization overwhelmed the girl. Her hands felt not a blanket of snow, but soft blankets. Where was she? The voice of the chief magician of the empire, Guam Aces, the gray-haired director of the Royal Academy, was heard. He looked up from the book he was reading and asked the witch how she was feeling, since she had been sleeping for several days. Sierra clutched the blanket and let out a desperate cry as she asked the principal what had happened to the ice dragon. The old man slammed the book shut, replying that the dragon had been destroyed and that Charlotte herself needed to lie down, rest, and not worry about anything. The lenses of his glasses flashed as the man looked closely at Sierra and asked what happened in the end and how the monster died. Biting her lip, Charlotte frantically tried to remember at least something, but she couldn't do it. Aces chuckled under his breath, so that's how it is. He brought a thing to the girl that looked like a small lamp the size of a finger, in which a purple light was burning, and asked her to take a closer look. Charlotte stared at the flames in shock. The mage said that when he arrived at the battlefield, the fire was next to the witch. Even when Sierra didn't come to her senses, it didn't disappear. Hellfire is a flame that humans can never manipulate unless it is. The witch clenched her teeth angrily and finished the director's speech. If this is not an apostle. The man, fingering the strands of his long beard, said that the apostles had long since disappeared. But since hellfire had appeared in this battle, it meant that they clearly didn't know something. Aces placed the book on the table before leaving the room. Finally, he told the silently sitting witch that she had tried hard and should rest, so he was leaving so as not to disturb her. The old man, without turning around, said that in addition, the Empire would claim that it was Charlotte's squad that defeated the Ice Dragon. Then he finally turned around and smiled, comforting the dejected Sierra. After all, everything connected with the apostles would cause a lot of unnecessary panic, so the girl should just accept all the honors and praise. She, clutching the blanket with all her might, whispered to the rest of the room that she would do it. The people gathered at the walls of the academy, enthusiastically greeting Sierra and thanking her for the victory. Meanwhile, in the city tavern, one of the military detachments gathered to have a feast. Yulman sat in the corner of the bar, holding his forehead with his hand. He was worried that there would be a fuss when his identity was revealed. But then it dawned on the guy. He would never see cute girls who would treat him like a hero, because the apostle came to the world of people to find himself a girlfriend. Throwing a bag of things over his shoulder, he got ready to leave, and thought about leaving this city and hiding somewhere. Meanwhile, a detachment of Imperial warriors was heading towards the doors of the tavern. Tears appeared in the brunette's eyes as he said goodbye to his favorite tavern and the beautiful lady behind the bar. The knights approached the doors of the bar, and the leading warrior, a fair-haired man in a red cloak, loudly asked those present which of them was a mercenary. Everyone in the tavern looked around and simultaneously pointed their fingers at Yulman, who was trying to hide. The guy froze. Had he really been exposed? The commander-in-chief loudly reported that Yulman was now invited to take part in the entrance test to the Royal Academy. The warriors began to hum in displeasure. This is the very best academy in the Guam Empire, and this guy only recently came here. Why did they call him? In response to the indignation, the man asked a counter-question. Did everyone present here participate in the battle against the Ice Dragon together with this man? The warriors' faces lengthened. Could it really be about the recent battle against the Ice Dragon? Someone spoke into the silence that only a handful of people survived there, and this guy was one of them. The man in the red cloak pointed at Yulman. Besides all this, the guy was safe and sound in the battle. He asked the warriors if they had any questions, and they fell silent again. Yulman raised his hand sharply. Clenching his fist, he asked as he exhaled if there were many beautiful girls in this academy. The commander-in-chief was at a loss. He clearly did not expect such a question. Meanwhile, the academy was indeed attended by young beauties in short school uniforms that did not hide their thighs in high stockings. The elastic chest rose in time with the girls' breathing. Yes, the Royal Academy of the Guam Empire could boast of its students, as if handpicked. Yulman had found himself in a real paradise. Aces stood on the balcony with the commander-in-chief, who asked the director why he decided to train an incompetent mercenary. The old man, squinting good-naturedly, replied that young people should be given the opportunity to prove themselves. The magician watched the young man spin like a top, looking at the pretty girls, and continued that these people could have unexpected talents. Yulman did not notice anything around him, looking lovingly at the short skirts. Ace's voice thundered through the hall, congratulating those in the building on getting the chance to enter the Royal Academy. And in order to see if they were suitable for the academy, the entrance test would begin right now. The man added that he hoped the candidates would do everything in their power to pass and survive, as various pentagrams painted red began to appear on the floor. Those present began to talk among themselves with concern. What did he mean? How to survive? Suddenly, huge clawed paws began to appear from the magic circles. A furious clicking sound could be heard from all around, and fiery demonic wolves emerged from the runes, summoning beasts that only experienced fire mages could summon. Trembling with fear, the candidates asked each other if this training would kill them. At the end of the hall, Yulman, who had developed a habit of calling all the pretty girls sisters, assured one of them that he would protect her, and that there was no reason to worry. The crowd scattered as a pack of fire wolves rushed towards them. Some still did nothing, not believing that this was a real monster. The apostle, putting his hands in his pockets, chuckled boredly. Is it really worth making such a fuss over such a small fish? One of the candidates tried to shake off the panic and began to cast a spell. He called on the others to show their best together, creating runes in the air with confident movements. A multitude of dark vines began to sprout from his palms. But they were no match for the wolves, who easily jumped up and playfully avoided the trap. Someone from the crowd released air currents at the enemies, but the fire wolves dealt with this even faster than with the vines. One of the magician's eyes widened. He had never expected such an outcome. What no one could have predicted was that one of the wolves would run up to the guy standing nearby and tear his head off with one jerk, licking his bloody mouth. The pink-haired witch shook in horror as it happened right next to her. The future students scattered when it became clear that this was not an imitation. The fire wolves really decided to kill everyone. There were desperate cries calling for escape. Yulman still seemed not to understand what was happening and awkwardly stood near the wall. Suddenly, someone loudly called the fleeing people fools. The tall, long-haired blonde man in uniform, who had been silent until then, created a shield between himself and the wolves, shouting that in such a situation, a mass exodus was indeed a stupid decision, as people were becoming targets for the enemy. He waved his hands and created magical aerial targets. They tightly enveloped the unsuspecting animals. The stranger then ordered the fleeing candidates to attack the wolves. It worked. The future students divided into their battle groups. Archers attacked with arrows from the left flank. The mages should attack from the right flank. The swordsmen are right in the center. A huge amount of magic and fighting force attacked the entire flock at once. A moment later, the immobilized monsters lay whining in different corners of the hall. The delighted candidates saluted each other and gave high fives. They did it. Loud cries of joy could be heard from everywhere that they had actually managed to win. But unfortunately, this was not the case. Red fiery figures were approaching the crowd. It wasn't the end, oh no! The flock suddenly merged into one huge bloody fiery dance. The future students raised their heads, watching in horror what was happening. From the flames he appeared, the fiery wolf Cerberus, several heads sticking out of one body, ready to tear apart anyone who came close. The magicians and warriors pointed their swords and wands at the monster. Cerberus watched them, spewed flames, and was made of it himself. The inspired candidates were ready to rush into battle. The blonde noticed that this was indeed a royal academy, since they were using such a dangerous monster for the test. The monster roared and released fiery clots from its body into the crowd. The candidates frantically thought about how to protect themselves from the flying fire. But the force of the attack was so great that it instantly knocked the warriors off their feet. Yulman, who had not moved from the spot since the beginning of the battle, who was watching this, felt one of the clots flying towards him without even taking his hands out of his pockets. He shrugged his shoulders. Such a weak attack, not even worth paying attention to. But the others made such a noise because of this. Suddenly he saw a shadow above him, of someone else's female breast. Yulman raised his head, blushing deeply. The stranger ran straight at him, pushing him away from the burning attack. Still red as a lobster, the boy looked reverently at the stranger lying on him. White hair tied with a bow and huge eyes of the girl, which examined the rescued. She rose to her knees, telling him to be careful because he almost got hit. The girl hung over him and asked if everything was okay. Yulman could only open and close his mouth. Another explosion went off, showering the couple with shards of glass and walls. The girl rose to her feet and walked away from Yulman, but turned around and wished him to be more careful next time. The discouraged boy sat on the steps and watched as the fragile stranger approached Cerberus, saying that the rest should be left to her. The apostle blushed again. She was really worried about him. Thoughts of battle faded into the background for him. Pressing his palms to his face, he realized that some feeling was making his heart beat faster. Meanwhile, the blonde girl swung her arm and created an ice boomerang, and the next moment she threw it at the monster. Ice boomerangs attacked the demonic dog from all sides. Crouching down, the stranger created a large magic circle. Vines began to crawl towards Cerberus, enveloping his powerful paws. The rest of the warriors stood menacingly. Their help should not be forgotten either. The girl asked to distract Cerberus for a while so that she could use a restraining spell. A crowd moved towards the dog from different angles, attacking with swords, arrows, and magic. The enraged Cerberus threw all his heads at his opponents, throwing them aside. Meanwhile, the witch jumped into the vacated space to cast a powerful attack spell from there. The magic circle hung directly above Cerberus's head. The dog raised its head and belched streams of fire in that direction. The girl stretched out her hands and created ice shackles. First, ice crystals stretched out under Cerberus, trapping the dog's paws. Then, from above, collars fell out of the magic circle for each of the monster's heads. Cerberus found himself trapped in ice, with ice collars around his neck and his paws shackled by ice floes. The surprised candidates opened their mouths. Could she really have done it? Yulman smiled dreamily. The test should be over soon, and he himself would definitely talk to this young lady later. Sierra, standing in the distance, smirked. No, this is not the end. Suddenly, a powerful stream of fire flew right next to the blonde witch's face. She turned around abruptly, not understanding what was happening. Right behind her, Cerberus was burning all the ice magic she had created with hellfire. With the teeth of 3 mouths clicking, he bit through the collars and trampled the ice under his paws. The girl jumped to the side. What kind of flame was this? The blonde man who had attacked Cerberus earlier shouted that some idiot had used fire magic. His hair flew up as the boy created a powerful wind barrier that blocked the flames. The crowd began to buzz. Could he really cope with fire? What amazing wind magic! The air currents picked up the dog and lifted him up. Yulman told himself that the wind could not extinguish the flame, but it could contain it. Had this man really calculated such subtleties? Despite this, after a few seconds, Cerberus was free and ran towards the blonde witch. The girl cowered in fear as a huge shadow loomed over her. A nascent magic flashed in her palm and immediately died out. It had not yet been restored. Yulman came to the forefront. This was his chance to show himself. He suddenly appeared right in front of the witch, grinning triumphantly in advance, and she screamed in surprise. Grabbing the stranger by the shoulder, he pulled her towards him. Turning away from Cerberus, Yulman hugged the witch, whispering that his sweet little sister shouldn't be afraid. The apostle's red eyes glittered with anticipation. He said pompously that this wild dog just needed to be kicked so that it would finally shut up, and he put his left hand forward, clutching the girl in his right. From the powerful magic, Cerberus flew sharply into the opposite wall and landed on it with a crash, destroying the surface. Yulman chuckled. He should be able to charm his little sister with this. He looked down and saw her face turn red and her eyes fill with tears. Without letting go of the witch, he asked worriedly if he had hurt her while kicking that dog. She, without moving, tearfully asked to finally let her go. And only then did Yulman realize what kind of softness and elasticity he had been feeling in his hand for a long time. The blonde witch pressed her fists into his chest and turned her head away, asking him not to touch her. The apostle, blushing, quickly walked away and put his hands forward, apologizing and assuring that he didn't do it on purpose. Both of them, blushing, stood at a distance from each other. The other guys, watching this scene, were indignant. How dare this scoundrel use such a moment to touch the goddess? And when did he even manage to approach her? A clear female voice was heard. At this point, their test was over. The crowd parted, and a beautiful, stately woman appeared before those present. She stood at the ruined steps, her arms folded across her chest. One of the candidates, covered in scratches and with some of his clothes charred, asked in surprise who she was. The stranger sternly introduced herself, Sarah, deputy director. The blonde man who attacked Cerberus with his strong magic asked the woman reproachfully what the hell happened here, and she was surprised by the question. Then the guy pointed his finger at the lifeless body of one of the students. Could a regular test for the Royal Academy really just kill people? Sarah narrowed her eyes and smiled mysteriously. Before the blonde could even blink, the deputy director seemed to use magic to draw out all the destruction, human, and that which had affected the building itself. Moreover, from the way the supposedly dead students gradually disappeared, it became clear that this was just an illusion. The woman waved her long hair and found translucent cards in her hands. She laughed. What did they say about the students? The blonde looked at Sarah in bewilderment. Was this really puppet magic? The warriors were talking among themselves about the rumors that there was a deputy director of the Royal Academy who could control objects using magic. Sarah stepped forward and said that now that everything was settled, she wanted to say a few words. First of all, the vice principal wanted to congratulate the remaining people on passing the test and being accepted into the ace class of the Guam Royal Academy. Yulman perked up his ears when a couple of pretty girls started discussing how Ace's class was being taught by a great wizard, and who would be doing it this year. The boy's eyes lit up. What if it turns out to be his cute little sister? Sarah caught everyone's attention again, announcing the teacher of Ace's class. A shock of red hair flashed before Yulman's eyes. He took a step back in surprise. The vice principal introduced Sierra Charlotte, the new class leader and the person in charge of the students. She sternly glanced at those present with her blue eyes. The blonde witch opened her mouth in admiration. The fire witch herself would teach them. Sarah said that it seemed like everyone had heard of Sierra's teacher reputation, but if there were any other questions, they could ask her directly. Sierra said goodbye to her deputy, who said she needed to get back to her duties and left the room. The crowd enthusiastically clung to the girl, bombarding her with questions about what they would do now. Yulman, meanwhile, tried in every way to avoid being seen. Sierra, arms folded across her chest, was deadly serious as she explained that the students were free for today, but that tomorrow, at 7 o'clock in the morning, they needed to gather at the training grounds to practice fighting. After a long silence, she added that she hoped that the warriors would get along with each other, and if there were no more questions, those present could disperse. But the long-haired magician was not going to let her go so easily. He called out to Charlotte. She turned around, unhappy that she had been distracted. He shouted that if they got into the ace class because of her strength, then why did that guy get through too? Naturally, he could not help but notice Yulman creeping from the center of the hall, and in his speech he singled him out from the crowd. The apostle forced a smile. "Calm down, you need to control yourself." Sierra looked at the guy with confusion and asked what was wrong with him. Yulman was immediately buried under a pile of accusations. The crowd said that he had done nothing, that he was lustful as a wolf, that he pestered his female students every now and then, and that he was simply awful. The blonde witch immediately stood up for him. She said that it was a lie, that he was there to help her, and the rest was just an accident. Some student gasped, "What a kind goddess!" Sierra walked quickly towards the apostle. At first he was horrified inside, but he thought that he had erased her memory that time, which meant the girl shouldn't recognize him. The red-haired witch looked closer, thoughtfully saying that the guy's face seemed familiar to her, and they could have met somewhere, but he waved his hands as if to say that it was impossible, and she had confused him with someone else. Charlotte clearly didn't trust him and asked her question again. Yulman waved it off again. He would certainly remember such a nice girl. He definitely wouldn't forget. The guys from the crowd began to indignantly talk about how this guy dared to hit on the fire witch herself. The teacher shouldn't allow such a person to enter Ace's class. The girl raised her hand, calling them to calm down. She would only place the boy in Ace's class temporarily. She said that the girl he saved explained that the student did nothing wrong. Besides, he was the only one who dared to help her and stood up to Cerberus. This courage is not like that of an ordinary person. Yulman broke into a reverent smile and thanked Teacher Sierra for such a compliment. Charlotte challenged the crowd. If any of them were unhappy with her decision, let them try to convince her otherwise. The silence in the hall meant only one thing. There were no people willing to do this. The fair-haired mage clenched his teeth in anger. Finally, this long day ended, and night came. Aces received Sierra and Sarah in his office. He, folding his hands in front of him in a lock, asked if all those who felt in the battle against the ice dragon got into Ace's class. Charlotte replied that it was true. She leaned forward anxiously and asked if it was possible that the apostle would also be among these disciples. The director leaned back in his chair and asked how the entrance test went. Sarah revealed that there was a student on the test who was capable of standing up to Cerberus. She frowned and continued to talk about how they didn't see the moment he was right in front of the dog, because the next second Cerberus flew so far away as if his body was out of control. The old man thought for a moment and replied, "If the monster flew away, then perhaps the student used talent magic. Spells that ordinary magicians cannot use, only a few, and very capable ones. Talent magic is the rarest type of magic." Sierra convinced herself that maybe this was true. Aces looked at the large grandfather clock opposite and advised the girls not to think too much about the apostle, as it was already quite late, and sent them off to rest. The witches bowed and prepared to leave, wishing the director a good night and a good rest. A few seconds later, the door slammed behind them. The old man muttered something into his beard. He reached into his desk drawer and grabbed the beautiful carved handle. In the box there was a lamp with a purple, hellish flame blazing in it. Taking the jar in his hand, the director stared at the light, and his loud sigh echoed throughout the office. Yulman, dressed in an academy uniform, walked sadly around the yard, complaining about having to get up so early. He yawned sweetly. He really wanted to sleep, but the dream immediately disappeared as soon as he noticed the blonde crown of the witch he had saved. Sparks danced in her eyes. This was yesterday's little sister. It was high time to talk to the stranger. He ran towards her, shouting greetings as he went. He suddenly turned deeply red and ran closer. The witch's chest swayed as soon as she turned around. The guy almost fainted from this sight. He was in heaven. The girl, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, asked in a gentle voice what he wanted. Yulman's cheeks turned red, and he awkwardly recalled yesterday's incident during the test. The witch also blushed deeply. She denied it and assured him that everyone had misunderstood everything, and that she should thank her savior. The student giggled and asked his name, introducing herself as Aisha. Yulman began feverishly thinking about how to avoid pronouncing his real name. He replied that his name was Lu, just his first name. no last name. Aisha noted that the name suited him. The apostle awkwardly scratched the back of his head and suggested that they go to class together. A long-haired blonde man watched them from afar. He growled quietly, still unhappy with the presence of the impudent guy. Finally, the students gathered in the large hall, and Sierra, standing in front of them, suggested that the lesson begin. She put her hands on her hips, cast magic runes on the floor, and announced that today the students would fight each other, and their opponent would be. But Charlotte didn't manage to finish speaking because a huge fire tiger jumped out onto the crowd right from the circle. The student, clearly one of the smartest in the class, noted that the Yang tiger, although a normal fire-type summon beast, had great firepower. The long-haired mage mockingly said that they would be dealing with only the Yang tiger. Was it really fair to the tiger itself? Charlotte immediately retorted. She didn't say that there would be only one animal. There will be a lottery whereby students will be divided into pairs, with 2 people with the same number forming a group. While she was saying that they would have to defeat the tiger within an hour, more and more huge saber-toothed cats appeared behind her. Yulman unfolded the sheet. There was number 7. Aisha got the first number. The guy whined that fate was not at all kind to him. Meanwhile, someone approached the witch, and she turned around at the sound of footsteps. The long-haired mage bowed respectfully to her and introduced himself, saying that he was very lucky to have the opportunity to team up with such a beautiful miss. His name was Kyle, and the boy was the eldest son of the Smith family. But the witch seemed unimpressed by Kyle's attempts to charm her, and worriedly suggested that they first discuss battle strategy, since they had little time left. The magician waved his hand at those present and confidently replied that, compared to the others, he believed that one person would be enough to defeat the Yang tiger, so let the girl let him figure it out. Aisha wanted to say something but didn't have time. Kyle had already started walking towards the tigers, saying at the end that it wouldn't take long. He thought with a cheeky smile that, with the strength of his family, he would deal with the tiger, and then this girl would take care of him. The magician stopped a few meters from the fire tiger. He held his hand out in front of him, conjuring something, saying that the animal looked very cute. The wind blade spell swept through the hall like a whirlwind, heading towards the monster. Sierra, who was watching this, thought that Kyle's talent magic was a broken limiter. It could increase the outgoing magic attack by 1 level. Now, with the increase effect, his attack level had increased to intermediate, or even advanced, talent magic. Ian made a furrow in the stone floor with his claws, flying back a couple of meters. The wildcat's yellow eyes narrowed with rage. He roared and released a burst of fire from his mouth. Kyle clenched his palms and called him a pathetic insect as he cast another spell. He threw a new stream of air straight at the tiger, which again doused everything with fire. A wave of fire passed right past the crowd. The wind lifted the girls' skirts and they began to cover them with their hands, squealing. The boys coughed from the dust and flashes of fire. Kyle smiled smugly, saying that as he said, he managed to quickly deal with the monster. He walked slowly towards Aisha, telling her how easy the training was, but she looked behind him in horror. The girl screamed, warning the magician of the danger. Kyle looked around sharply, not understanding what was happening. Suddenly, a completely alive and even more angry tiger, Yang, pounced on him. The magician looked at the approaching monster with confusion. The guy continued to awkwardly shift around in place. It seems he only woke up when he saw a monster flying towards him with outstretched paws. Tiger Yang knocked him to the ground. Looming over Kyle, the animal released a deadly stream of fire from its mouth. A student from the crowd turned to Sierra with concern. The tiger would destroy the magician on the spot, but she didn't even react, but continued to watch the fight with her brows furrowed. The entire hall was filled with raging fire, and for a moment the silhouettes of the fighters disappeared from sight. Suddenly the tiger recoiled in shock, and then he flew back, thrown back by the flow of air. Kyle, who only had damage to his clothes, stood with a victorious smile, his hands in his pockets. He was not going to die here. The guy approached Aisha, asking her opinion, because their team should be the first to complete this task. Charlotte approached the couple and called them. She congratulated the winners and allowed them to rest, as they were the second to complete the task. Kyle was incredibly surprised, as was the witch behind him. He immediately shouted that it was impossible. No one could do it faster than him, and that there was some kind of mistake. The teacher pointed somewhere to the side, and that's where the team that finished first was located. They had already completed the task and were one step ahead of Aisha and Kyle, the latter of whom kept repeating that it was impossible. When the enthusiastic crowd parted, they saw an incredible picture. The fire tiger, like a house cat, lay on its back, wriggling comically, and Lou and her partner stroked its belly and called it a cutie. This is what happened 15 minutes ago. Still frustrated, Yulman lamented the impossibility of being paired with Aisha. Suddenly, someone came up to him and called out. He turned around, asking who was speaking to him. A warlike-looking student stood in front of him, holding an axe in her hands as if it weighed nothing, and boldly said that they were now in the same group and the guy could call her Arya. But Yulman did not pay attention to her and continued to sigh languidly for Aisha. This made the girl quite angry, and the other students now laughed at the couple. Hissing in annoyance, Arya swung her weapon with all her might and lunged straight at Lu to get his attention. But he seemed not to notice anything around him. Finally, he sighed heavily. Then he stopped the axe flying towards him with 2 fingers. Still looking at the piece of paper, the apostle assured that he had heard everything. Arya's face darkened. This guy, she easily threw the weapon over her back and mockingly said that she heard that Lu was a real pervert, causing him to cry out in indignation. Turning around, the girl threw out one last word that she alone would cope with the Tiger Yang, and that her partner should not cause problems. He watched thoughtfully as Arya, weapon in hand, walked towards the tiger. Could she really handle it alone? The student jumped straight at the animal with a scream. Then she brought the axe down with a crash, but not entirely successfully. Tiger Yang jumped to the side. He roared, opening his fanged mouth. A shadow fell across the girl's face, and her eyebrows drew together at the bridge of her nose. She shifted her weight to her right leg, holding the base of the axe firmly in her hands. Then she suddenly lunged with her foot straight at the tiger's face. But with this, Arya trapped herself. A fiery vine, a tiger's tail, closed around her ankle. A few seconds later, the animal threw the student far back with its tail. Her axe spun through the air several times like a boomerang, and a little later it landed with a crash, hitting the marble floor, making a hole there. Arya huddled up and found herself on her knees, the weapon falling right next to her. The next moment, the tiger picked up speed and pounced from above straight at the girl. The student weakened, clenched her teeth in helplessness. She grabbed the base of the axe tightly and pointed it at the tiger. The animal sank its teeth into the wooden base. His teeth were dangerously close to Arya's hand. The girl closed her eyes tightly, surrendering to chance, if only she were a little stronger. At the moment when the Tiger Yang had already begun to pounce on the student, Yulman's voice was heard, addressing the wild cat, asking why she was cruel to his little sister. The boy's eyes gleamed dangerously, and he muttered something about a little kitten, as if he was out of his mind. Suddenly, the tiger loosened his grip and even seemed somehow taken aback. As usual, Yulman, with his hands in his pockets, rocked on his toes and said that the matter with the tiger was decided. Arya opened one eye and stared at him in bewilderment. And then she immediately discovered that opposite her was no longer a fierce, fire-breathing tiger, but an affectionate and playful cat. She pointed her finger at the surprised monster in shock and hysterically asked what had happened to it. Sierra, who was standing nearby, noted that the hardest way to defeat a monster was to tame it. Aisha clapped her hands and exclaimed in delight that this was the first time she had seen a person do something like this. Kyle's eyes narrowed, thinking this was some kind of nonsense. He was seriously angry. Not only had he fought, but these two were just lucky enough to encounter a harmless animal. Meanwhile, Yulman and Arya were squatting next to the tame tiger and scratching its belly. The long-haired mage walked up to Lu and said loudly that he really envied him. Arya looked up at the guy. He asked with a wry smile why Lu was so lucky, since he had met a harmless tiger. The apostle's partner stood up abruptly, attacking Kyle with accusations. At this time, the other students also began to be indignant, saying that Kyle was right. Their team had come across a very angry tiger. Some were even wounded during the battle. Yulman smiled and said that it was all because of his magic, in magic called taming the beast. Hearing this, Charlotte's eyes widened as she stared at the guy. Kyle rolled his eyes. He had never heard of such talent magic. Could Lu demonstrate it to everyone to prove his point? The apostle grinned in response to this. The tiger, lying on its back, immediately stood up. All the tigers that took part in the test began to circle around Yulman. The crowd buzzed. What's going on with these fire cats? The apostle did not answer, but only looked away. As if on command, the entire pride lay down on the floor and bent over in something like a bow before Yulman. He, smiling from ear to ear, quoted the proverb, "If you don't see it, you won't believe it. But if you haven't seen it, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Hearing this, Kayla was overcome with anger from defeat and not understanding what was happening. Aisha seemed speechless at what she saw. Arya could only open and close her mouth, silently watching what was happening. This pervert was hiding such power. The crowd was silent too. The students just stared at Yulman with wide eyes. Sierra interrupted this scene. She had had enough. She created a magical circle of fire in the air. The test was over for today, and all the tigers disappeared into the swirl of the magic circle. The teacher walked up to Lu and sternly asked when he would register his talent magic. The guy scratched his cheek and replied that no one asked him to do this. Charlotte bowed and apologized to the students, as she urgently needed to visit the academic affairs office and bring in new information. The girl let the students go and went to the exit, while the apostle thought that, fortunately for him, in one of the human novels that he had read, there was talent magic, taming, which meant that Sierra should not suspect anything. The sun illuminated the inner courtyards of the academy. Arya, Yulman, and Aisha were walking along the alley. Arya slapped the guy hard on the shoulder and exclaimed that she didn't expect such strength from such a pervert, and that he was a good guy. The apostle was indignant at this and asked not to call him that, because he had a name, Lu. Aisha chuckled softly as she listened to their bickering. The fun was interrupted by Kyle appearing in front of them. He dryly addressed Yulman, that now he understood what kind of talent magic it was, and it was not surprising that Cerberus from the entrance test did not attack him. The other disciples, hearing this, looked at each other. It really seemed like the truth. The apostle sighed. Well, here it goes again. The warriors continued to talk. Someone said that with the ability to control the summoned beast, the guy could have directed Cerberus to attack the others. He was told that Lu could have done it deliberately in order to have the opportunity to touch the goddess. The apostle was amazed at how developed the human imagination could be. Arya spoke up in his defense, loudly saying that this couldn't have happened, because if Cerberus had been set on the students, would they have been able to pass? This made sense. The warriors did not know what to answer. Aisha couldn't stand the injustice and said that talent magic requires great ability and long training. Besides, the wind barrier that time was unlikely to resist Cerberus, and Lu saved her, and the girl feels only gratitude. She expressed the hope that the students will not make erroneous assumptions. Kyle growled at Aisha's words. She said that the wind barrier wouldn't be able to stand. What impudence! The guy's fists involuntarily clenched, ready to pounce on the enemy, whom they were also protecting. He couldn't believe that the student was lying to help that freak. Yulman sincerely thanked the blushing Aisha, to which Arya jealously reminded him of herself. There was silence in the director's office, interrupted only by the ticking of the large grandfather clock. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and the director allowed them to enter. Sierra literally flew into the room saying that she had found him, a man with the magic talent of taming. Aces sat up straight in his chair in surprise, his fingers clasped together tense. The man asked how strong the beasts were that this student could control. Charlotte thought for a moment and replied, "It's not clear yet. It seems like he can instantly tame a beast like Cerberus." Aces ordered the teacher to find out as quickly as possible. The trio of new friends strolled lazily around the building. Arya stretched sweetly, regretting that the time for rest ended so quickly. Aisha, studying the scroll in her hand, remarked that if she was not mistaken, the class would be studying history today. When Lu asked again, she replied that she had heard that it was a subject that looked deeply into many major historical events. Yulman's eyebrows drew together, and he hoped that they wouldn't talk about the cities he had bombed. Suddenly, Arya saw Sierra and greeted her. Aisha and Yulman exchanged glances. The guy was dejected. He had a bad feeling. Charlotte immediately, without any ceremony, called the student to the court tower. The inside of the court tower was decorated with statues of 4 beautiful maidens on columns, located around the arena with signs inscribed on it. Sierra and Lu found themselves right in the center of the arena. The area was also illuminated by 4 multicolored magic balls on high stands. Yulman smiled awkwardly, wondering why Miss Sierra brought him to this place. The girl replied that she wanted to ask the student a question. Suddenly, a circle of fire formed around the arena, and the teacher herself rose into the air and, warningly, said her name, then said that she would ask her question only once. Would Lu become the Fire Witch's apprentice? The guy was taken aback. It was very sudden. Sierra smiled triumphantly in advance. She was sure that no one would refuse to be a student of the great imperial magician. But her expectations were not met. Yulman crossed his arms in front of himself, apologized, and refused. At first, the Fire Witch did not understand what exactly the guy answered. She smiled and asked to wait a little. But then the realization dawned on her mind. Sierra screamed, pointing her finger at Lu, who stood calmly. She was beside herself and yelled at Yulman, unable to believe that he dared to refuse. The guy rolled his eyes once again. Yes, he is only here to find himself a wife, and he is not going to become someone's apprentice and work hard. Suddenly, his eyes sparkled. Lu thought out loud that there was no rule that prohibited a student and teacher from getting married. But Charlotte did not support this idea. warning the student not to even think about it. The apostle sighed in disappointment. What a pity. He turned around and waved his hand, asking Sierra to forget about it. The witch clenched her teeth in irritation. She asked ironically how Lu planned to find a wife given his status. The girl suggested that he remember how the guy lived before he got to this academy. Yulman lowered his head and indulged in memories of the time when he first came to the world of people. Huge price tags, bigger than the records of the apostles, he walked past the shop windows and was horrified by the prices of ordinary cakes, a large commission that took most of his coins. He vividly imagined Aisha running away from him because he was too poor, and therefore they could not be together. Yulman raised his head to the ceiling and screamed in horror that this would never happen. Sierra smiled contentedly. She had finally managed to appeal to the student's voice of reason. She raised her finger and offered a deal. If Lu became her apprentice, he would gain status and access to her property. She rose up again, and fire began to blaze around her, and fiery flashes also burst from her hands. The witch asked her question again. Is Lu ready to become Sierra Charlotte's apprentice? Without turning around, the apostle's voice was heard, asking Miss Sierra if she really thought she could convince him just by that. He turned around and smiled slyly. And at that very moment, like a child, he ran to the teacher with a squeal. He agreed to become Master Sierra's student. The witch was loudly indignant when she realized that Lu had simply jumped and grabbed her leg. The next moment, they both fell to the floor, Yulman tightly hugging his teacher's hips with both hands. The guy also demanded a reward from the master. At the same moment, various magical symbols and constellations began to appear on the ceiling, shimmering in blue. An immobilized Sierra said that the student might not bow to her, and he should have let go of her already. A completely happy Yulman, without letting go of Sierra, asked what was wrong with the student holding the master's hips. Suddenly, fiery flashes began to burst out all around the perimeter of the circle in which they lay. The apostle looked around in surprise, not understanding what was happening. The flashes grew larger and larger, and now they were jumping around the entire hall like sunbeams. Sierra hissed that Lu was an idiot. Finally, a dome of fire covered them both, and one of the statues on the column said in a muffled voice that the contract was concluded. Yulman felt his forehead heat up as a mark appeared there, looking like a small fire dragon. He slapped his palm. Something strange had happened to his forehead. Sierra, freed from the embrace, was beside herself with rage. She grabbed the apprentice by the scruff of the neck and started shouting that when a contract between a master and an apprentice is made, the contract mark appears at the place where they touch. The boy, embarrassed, quietly noted that Charlotte had not warned him. The witch, realizing that nothing could be changed, sighed and let go of the wayward student. Wearily putting her hand to her face, she said that, in any case, this mark does not appear just like that. Yulman, hearing this, jumped up and down with delight, asking if this meant that Sierra's mark was on her thigh. But the girl ordered him to get lost. A day later in the academic canteen, two students from Sierra's class were talking among themselves, discussing Lu's invitation to the courthouse tower yesterday and how it seemed he hadn't returned from there yet. Ari and Aisha couldn't get enough food, and the girls sadly thought about the fate of their friend. Arya cried out belligerently that in the court tower, the Royal Academy judges and punishes students. Aisha clutched the hem of her dress, nervously protesting that the boy had done nothing wrong. Kyle came up to them and joined the conversation, laughing when he heard what the girls were talking about. He smiled evilly and said that Lu must have lied about his taming talent magic, and it was discovered. And now the lower classes were worried about each other. Raising an eyebrow, he added that he must have been expelled yesterday. After all, scum is scum. Arya jumped up from the table and loudly, screaming, asked him what the hell he was talking about. Aisha tried to calm her classmate down, but she failed. Kyle couldn't stop himself from throwing mud at the student, calling them, like Lu, scum. The blonde witch tried to defend the apostle. She objected to Kyle that he himself saw the magic of Lu's talent with his own eyes, and he would do well to watch his words. At that moment, Yulman's voice was heard. He asked if everyone was talking about him. Kyle narrowed his eyes and looked carefully at the guy who entered. The apostle, as always, was unperturbed and kept his hands in his pockets. He said that he had only been gone one night, and they had already missed them. While he pressed his back against the wall and languidly put his palm to his forehead, the guy had an impressive bag of money hanging on his belt. Aisha jumped up from the table and rushed towards Lu. He clapped his hands. His little sister, as always, remained a cutie. Arya put her hands on her hips and said reproachfully that Lu was still just as lustful. The guy repelled the attack with a smile, calling his partner just as cruel and active. Arya folded her arms across her chest and feigned indifference as she asked Lu to tell her why Teacher Sierra had taken him away yesterday. Kyle, who no one had asked, butted in again, mockingly asking what the student and teacher were doing there. He assumed that Lu had been expelled from the academy. Aisha sobbed, "This is not true." The apostle raised an eyebrow and looked at the offender. Then he raised his head high and said that Master Sierra had made a contract with him. In the dining room, where most of the students were tensely following the conversation, silence reigned. All eyes were on Lu. A contract between a master and a student? The apostle summoned magical streams of fire, and that very mark appeared on his forehead. It would prove to everyone that the guy was not lying. Kyle, pretending not to be impressed, said that even if his classmate had beast-taming magic, he was just lucky that there were beasts on the test, because if it were different, would he have gotten into Ace's class? The guy bared his teeth and challenged Lu to a fight with him, Kyle Smith. Aisha couldn't remain silent when her savior was insulted, so she clenched her fists and replied that even if that was the case, Lu had talent magic, enough to enter the Ace class. The apostle looked admiringly at the girl who defended him so zealously. The long-haired mage abruptly moved his palm, causing a magical flow of air. He, like a knife, rushed towards Aisha and cut off several strands of her hair. Lu and Arya immediately huddled together and ran up to their friend. Kyle shook his hand and sharply told the offended witch not to butt into someone else's conversation unless she was asked to. Arya ran up to Aisha, excitedly asking if she was okay. The girl nodded timidly. The apostle moved closer to Kyle to talk. He agreed to fight the magician. Then a spark flashed in his red eyes as he asked Mr. Kyle in all seriousness to be gentle with him. The wind currents created by Kyle gradually dissipated. He and Lu now stood opposite each other, each gazing at the other. Yulman folded his arms across his chest and asked what the rules and conditions of their duel would be. Smith replied that he would release the maximum of his energy and strike. If Lu held out, it would mean victory, and if he lost, he would immediately leave Ace's class. Arya clenched her fist. How mean this magician is. There isn't a single monster there now. It's not fair at all towards Lu. Aisha, frightened, said nothing, only looked pitifully at Lu. Yulman was not at all scared. He said with a smile that Mr. Kyle looked confident. He laughed mockingly right in his classmate's face. At first, he continued to stand motionless, then air magic runes formed in the air. From the small whirlwind that appeared, the magician pulled out a superbly constructed sword. The apostle raised his eyebrows in surprise. Aisha, who had retreated to a safe distance, stood at the stands, but upon seeing the appearance of the weapon, she jumped up and shouted that this could not be. Arya, who was standing behind her, asked what was the matter. The witch, looking somewhere into the distance, told a legend. One day, the ancestor of the Bale family received a gift from the king of the elements. Countless amounts of gold and silver that did not fit into the carved chests. And one of the rarest treasures is the magic sword. Aisha wondered if she remembered the name of the weapon for sure. It was he, that same famous and unattainable Excalibur. Yulman smiled slyly, saying that Kyle had an interesting sword. He bit his index finger and set new conditions. If he lost, he would not only leave the class but also leave the academy. Holding Excalibur in front of him, the blonde brazenly replied that Lu had finally realized that he didn't belong here. Yulman ignored the attack, but offered to take Kyle's sword if he won. The magician tensed up when he heard such a proposal, not that he was unsure of himself. At the podium, Arya, in her usual manner, screamed, calling Lu a pervert and wishing him to deal with Kyle. The apostle smiled and mockingly asked Kyle if he thought he could lose. The offended blonde clicked his teeth and accepted the conditions. He told his opponent not to blame him for the lack of beasts that could help block Excalibur. Kyle, twirling the sword in his hand, urged Lu not to ask for mercy. Smith, moving the sword in front of him, began to cast spells in an ancient language. Yulman, who stood calmly in the same place, watched this and noticed that the weapon was releasing magical energy quite well. The girls caught their breath at the tension in the air. Kyle swung with all his might, and he rushed at the apostle with his sword at the ready, using the air sentence spell. Yulman only smirked at this attack. He lazily extended his left hand and held it out in front of Kyle. In a matter of seconds, the apostle created a fiery shield, which the unsuspecting Kyle struck with all his might with his sword. The magician exhaled in amazement, and the air currents from his magic covered Aisha and Arya with their heads. The air cloud completely hid the battlefield and the fighting students. The girls leaned forward, trying to see at least something. Who would win? Kyle stared ahead, unseeing. How could this bastard do it? The apostle, hiding his eyes under his bangs, said that they should not waste time. Smith stared at his opponent in shock. Lu, meanwhile, was already holding the sword in his hands, carefully stroking the blade, saying that he would accept Excalibur. He continued mockingly, thanking Mr. Kyle for his generosity and gift, while Kyle stood in front of him and clenched and unclenched his fists furiously. Iria and Alicia, jumping up and down with anticipation, loudly asked Lou if he was okay. Yulman turned his head to Kyle, reminding him of the attack on Aisha, and expressed hope that this would not happen again. At this, his red eyes lit up with a dangerous fire. The blonde still seemed unable to accept his defeat and looked at Lou with wide eyes. Yulman, seeing his enemy approaching him again, sharply extended his right hand, not letting go of Excalibur in his left. A powerful blast of fire hit Kyle's chest, sending him flying backwards. The guy spat blood out of his mouth. Such was the power of the enemy's spell. Smith flew quite a distance, and eventually, with a deafening roar, it hit the opposite wall, partially destroying it. Aisha and Arya's mouths dropped open in shock. Kyle lay there defeated, spitting out more and more blood. Yulman lowered his hand and smiled. Well, that's all. The clouds of dust cleared and everyone was left with a bloody Kyle lying on the floor. He rose to all fours, spitting out blood again. The magician raised his head, and a veil of rage clouded his eyes. This was impossible. Yulman smiled contentedly as he looked at Excalibur and said that he was taking it. Smith's furious look answered him. At that moment, Lou was called out. He turned around and saw Arya and Aisha running. Arya couldn't believe her eyes. She excitedly asked if Lou was really taking Excalibur. Aisha, smiling sweetly, praised her classmate, saying that he turned out to be stronger than she thought. He blushed and replied that he was indeed very strong. Arya had another brilliant idea and raised her index finger. The girl suggested throwing a party in honor of Lou's victory, since they had no more classes that day anyway. Yulman's eyes sparkled. He imagined an incredible amount of varied food and was already anticipating how he would try it. The trio turned to leave, shouting victory slogans as they went. A thin stream of blood flowed down Klein's chin, and he thought with horror what would happen to him if his father found out about the loss of Excalibur. Then he took a deep breath and, shouting with all his might, ordered his disciples to stop. Yulman stopped and turned around. Wiping his chin with the back of his hand, the fair-haired mage told the apostle that he could not give the sword to him. Aisha spoke up, reminding him that this was the condition Smith had agreed to, and she hoped the boy would be able to keep his word. Klein, annoyed, shouted that Lou had definitely cheated somehow, and just to be fair, the sword had to be returned. Yulman firmly replied that he refused. Smith was amazed at such audacity. He immediately began to create magical air currents, thereby announcing the battle. A large ball formed in the magician's hands, a concentration of his powers and a powerful weapon. The guy shouted to Lou, let him not think that he would leave this site intact. The Trinity found themselves right in the middle of a raging windstorm. Arya said loudly through the noise of the wind that Cain would definitely not allow himself to lose the sword. But a counterattack was already levitating in Yulman's palm. Magical fiery clots. He, smiling, assured that Smith would not succeed. The apostle gripped the hilt of the sword tighter with his other hand. He glanced down and felt some kind of energy coming from outside. Kyle created a vortex of air around himself again and told Lou that he would spare him if he obediently returned the sword to him. He raised an eyebrow and asked what would happen if he refused. Then Smith roared that the student would die right there on the spot. He was so angered by Lou's arrogance that he created one of his most powerful spells, the Wind Whirlwind Blade. The apostle watched the brewing storm with an unreadable expression on his face. The girls prepared to protect themselves from the wind with their hands. But suddenly, Kyle's magic connected with something previously unknown to the present. The space around was filled with a bright green color. Kyle screamed in shock, asking what was happening. Excalibur, which now rose above the warring parties, shone brighter than the sun. The tip of the handle with the precious stone shimmered and began to pulsate. Yulman stood closest to the source of light and looked at it unblinkingly. Aisha covered her eyes with her palms, unable to bear the glow. The apostle chuckled in surprise when he saw what was happening. In place of the sword, a cocoon formed, which rotated at an enormous speed. The outline of a man could be discerned in it, sitting inside in a fetal position. After a few moments, the cocoon dissipated and a girl with green hair appeared before those present. Her clothes were in the same colors and details as Excalibur earlier. The stranger landed softly on the floor. Bending one knee, she lowered her head before Yulman and introduced herself. The girl was the embodiment of the sword of the elemental king named Sylph, and she was greeting her new master. Arya leaned forward, surprised, asking her again what sword she was talking about. Aisha's mouth opened in mute surprise. Kyle also can't say a word from what he saw. The Sylph flew closer to the apostle. He He thoughtfully propped his chin on his index finger and asked if the girl was the spirit of this magic sword. She nodded and replied that, according to her agreement with Kyle, now she, the sword of the king of the elements, would belong to Lu. Sylph also asked if she could find out about her master's wishes. Arya noticed that the sword had a spirit. No wonder it was considered a precious treasure. Yulman scratched the back of his head and first asked Sylph to stand up. She obediently obeyed. Kyle was now beside himself with rage. The magician jumped up and ran to the spirit, saying that he was her master. The girl turned around when she heard these words. The magician continued, waving his arms, shouting that he definitely wouldn't have lost to that guy if she had shown up earlier. And he ordered Sylph to return to him immediately. Arya put her hands on her hips and said in disappointment that Kyle was really so shameless as to say such a thing. Aisha was silent and only nodded at her friend's words. Yulman turned to the spirit, deciding that it would be better if she weighed everything herself, and asked if the girl wanted to return. Sylph said a firm no. Raising her head, she reminded that the conditions had been agreed upon at the beginning of the duel. Looking straight into Kyle's eyes, the spirit continued that the old owner had bet her and lost. Naturally, this led to the owner changing, and now only Sylph herself decides whether to change the owner or not. The magician was beside himself with rage and powerlessness. Yulman stepped forward and, with barely concealed disgust in his voice, asked Kyle to stop humiliating himself even more, now that Sylph had explained everything. He was silent. Only his eyes betrayed his growing desire for revenge. Suddenly, the apostle turned around as if he remembered something important. He approached the spirit of Excalibur, patted her on the head, and asked for forgiveness for using her as a bet. When the girl's eyes widened, since no one had clearly apologized to her before, Yulman asked if she would help him in the future. Sylph blushed deeply. This owner was not like the others. She happily agreed, smiling broadly. Kyle's caustic laughter filled the space. He clenched his fists, looked angrily at the guys, and warned that he should not be underestimated. Using runic magic, he quickly created a red tornado. Wind currents, fueled by his anger, circled dangerously around the master. Kyle's face grew veiny as he screamed that a member of the Smith family could not allow such scum to insult him. The guy raised his hands up. The tornado continued to circle around its owner, now adding fiery flashes around the perimeter. The next moment, a burning phoenix of incredible size flew up into the air. Arya, blinded by its light, retreated back. She was afraid that such a monster would not leave even a piece of this place. Yulman smiled, urging him not to worry. The sword spirit grabbed her new master's hand in despair. Looking into his eyes, Sylph faithfully asked him to use her in battle. The apostle was delighted with such zeal, agreed, and asked the girl to lend her strength. The phoenix, opening its huge beak, rushed from above at Yulman, who was on the alert and was already creating magical waves of his magic. The boy clutched Excalibur in his hand, ready to attack. His eyes flashed predatorily in anticipation of victory. Yulman only had to swing his sword a few times for the firebird to disappear into thin air. There was a loud explosion, and Kyle was thrown back by his own magic being destroyed. Aisha and Arya managed to put up a translucent shield in front of themselves at the last moment. A few seconds later, the apostle stood on the rubble, his sword lowered, his left hand habitually resting in his pocket. Aisha pressed her hands to her chest and peered into the thick fog from the destruction of the stone floor and magic. Arya looked around with delight, her mouth open in admiration. Kyle lay on the floor, bruised and distraught. It was all over for him now. Sometime later, Yulman and his companions came to the restaurant. The seated guests, mostly their fellow students from the academy, took notice of the loud company. Arya grabbed the menu from the counter and waved it in the air, happily suggesting they celebrate their victory over Kyle. The company sat down at a large table, which was soon filled with various dishes, which were quickly brought by the waiters. The mouth-watering and bright desserts, of which there were no fewer than main courses and appetizers, were especially eye-catching. Sylph thoughtfully propped her chin on her hand, deciding what to do first. She had never seen such food before. Aisha smiled and told the girl sitting opposite her that the food prepared in this restaurant was very tasty and that it was definitely worth trying. Yulman's hair literally stood on end with delight, and an idea came to mind. Now he would have a chance to win Aisha's heart. Becoming serious, he asked his friend if she knew how to eat so that it tasted better. The interested witch suggested that the dish should be eaten while it was warm. The guy was in awe of his own genius. Directing a playful glance at Aisha, the apostle explained, "The person must be fed with a spoon." The poor girl's face flushed with embarrassment. Arya, distracted from her meal, slowly turned to Yulman and reported that she suddenly felt full. Meanwhile, in her office as the deputy director, Sarah sat at her desk, intensely focused on something. She used magic to make paper figures in the form of people move, and acted out the scene of Kyle and Yulman arguing that she had seen earlier. Taking the small sword from the hands of the figurine, apparently representing Yulman, she thoughtfully concluded that Kyle had ultimately lost his Excalibur to a student named Lou. The little man actively waved his paper head from the table at her. Sarah let out an irritated breath and ordered the figure to report this to Sierra and director Aces. They would decide together what to do. The deputy was worried. That sword had a spirit, which meant the Smith family wouldn't just let it go. Night fell, and the students returned to their rooms in the dormitory building. Yulman sprawled on the bed with a dreamy look, thoughts lazily replacing one another. At first, the apostle thought about the amazing ability of people to create delicious dishes from simple ingredients. Then her cheeks flushed as the image of Aisha appeared in her head. Today, she was so sweet and gentle. And what would happen if the apostle took her as his wife and they lived in his castle? The fantasy of the strongest apostle Yulman drew him Aisha in a cute apron. And with a plate of pie in her hands, the girl innocently asked whether Yulman would eat the food she had prepared, or would he eat his wife first. The level of passion in his blood was off the charts. The guy began to rock on the bed, blinded by such a bright game of the mind. The green crown of the sword spirit appeared at the bedside at such an inopportune moment, emotionlessly stating that its owner seemed to be very happy. Yulman squealed like a girl and crawled under the blanket in surprise. How could Sylph have scared him so much and appeared so suddenly? The girl looked down guiltily and apologized. She suddenly felt strong fluctuations in the emotional state of the owner, and therefore appeared without permission. The apostle felt sorry for the spirit. Looking at the girl's upset face, he said that everything was fine. Then Sylph ruffled his hair and asked him to warn him about his appearance next time, especially in human form. She asked seriously why the owner was happy. The boy looked dreamily out the window. He was happy because spring had come to him, and everything inside him was bubbling. The girl raised her index finger up. This is very similar to the desire for physiological needs that she has heard about. Yulman turned away, drooped, and replied that it was almost the same thing. Suddenly, he felt a spirit tugging at his shirt. The apostle turned around in surprise, staring at Sylph. She looked up shyly and stammered that she wasn't too sure, but maybe she could help the owner with his condition. The question finally brought Yulman to his senses. He blushed and exclaimed that this was not very good, and the spirit again, without unnecessary emotion, reminded him of her purpose, to help her master. Coughing into his fist, the apostle assumed a doomed look, but still allowed himself to help if the girl sincerely wanted it herself. A pair of scissors appeared in the spirit's hand. The guy chuckled in confusion, staring at the object. Sylph, looking bored, snapped her scissors in the air and announced that it would hurt, but she would try to be gentle. Only now did Yulman realize how recklessly he had behaved, and he began to apologize profusely to the girl. At this time, Sierra Charlotte was sitting on her bed in her bedroom with a stack of papers in her hands. She muttered thoughtfully to herself about the discrepancy between the surname of one of the students and the general. Suddenly, the girl's eyes fell on Yulman's personal file. She stared at the student's photo for a long time, wondering how he had beaten Kyle Smith today. The witch decided to ask Lou personally at the meeting tomorrow and put the documents aside. The last one on top was Aisha's case. The next day, Sierra called the student into the office. The sun was shining brightly through the floor-to-ceiling window, its rays playfully jumping across the flasks and test tubes placed around the office. But Charlotte's face did not express the joy of meeting Lou's student. She sat opposite him, gloomier than a cloud. The next moment, the witch stood up abruptly and banged her fist on the table. Leaning on it, the apostle nervously jumped up in his chair. Leaning low towards Yulman, she screamed right in his face, asking why the student had run to the cafeteria to brag about their contract, and later even started a fight with Kyle. The witch sat back down in her chair, but was still angry. It was as if Lou was deliberately creating problems for her. He raised his hands up, defending himself, and asked the master to calm down. Sooner or later, they would find out about this anyway. Sierra stood up and walked around the table, hands on her hips, demanding an explanation about the duel with Kyle. The apostle opened his eyes wide and began to lament that Smith had been the first to suggest a duel, and he looked at him so angrily at that moment as if he wanted to kill him. Moreover, the magician was very arrogant and used various tricks during the battle, but fortunately, thanks to his strength, Lou was able to easily defeat the impudent man. It occurred to Charlotte that her student was being arrogant, especially now. The witch looked at Lou suspiciously and asked how he was able to master the magic of the taming talent, because when concluding a mutual contract between a master and a student, she felt only the guy's basic magic, without an attribute. To this, Yulman playfully raised his finger and said that all his skills were natural. It was painful to look at Sierra. She thought dejectedly about how useless her student was. The witch turned her back to Yulman, standing by a large bookcase, studying the spines of books. She advised the student to get into less trouble and study the attributes of magic. Grabbing a particularly large book, Charlotte ordered Lou not to call her master because that made her feel like an old woman. He, smiling broadly, suggested that she become his wife instead of the master. His answer was a blow to the head with a thick tome. Sierra, towering over him, asked him to repeat the sentence with a special intonation. With a bump growing on his head, Yulman became more accommodating and said that he would stop calling the girl master. A little later, Sierra met the director of the academy on a picturesque street. They stood under the treetops and talked. The witch thanked Aces for resolving the issue with Excalibur. She said with concern that the Smith family had been unable to find him. The old man said that Kyle's skills weren't that good, and that losing Excalibur was well-deserved. Plus, his family shouldn't think that because they were stronger, they could do anything. He looked at Charlotte seriously and informed her that the Smiths knew about Lou's student status, and that Sierra was supposed to take the boy with her to a magical gathering next week. The witch replied that she would try to improve his skills before that time. Aces stroked his long beard and smiled. The older Sierra gets, the more polite she becomes. He suddenly remembered how she came to him when she was still very little. Having said with affection that now his ward was already grown up and independent, the old man coughed harshly into his fist. The girl immediately ran up to the director, frightened, asking what was wrong with him, but he replied that there was nothing special. It was just the years taking their toll. The witch looked at Aces with disappointment, holding him by the elbow. The old man patted the girl's hand reassuringly and advised her not to worry, but rather to concentrate on the magical congress. After all, it is possible that it is there that the chance to awaken her magic talent will appear. Charlotte replied that in that case she would be able to help the director, and he would not be so tired. Aces smiled into his beard. He would look forward to this day. Meanwhile, Yulman was leafing through textbooks in the academic library, Sylph accompanying him like a faithful servant. The guy, sitting cross-legged on the floor, was particularly interested in one book. He thoughtfully muttered that he had not known until now about people using attributes for the functionality of natural elements. Sylph approached the owner and handed him a cup of green tea, since the coffee that Yulman had asked for was not there. The apostle smiled, gratefully accepting the drink, assuring that the tea was also very tasty. The girl knelt down next to him and looked into his eyes devotedly. He was surprised by the sudden attention and asked what was going on. Sylph asked why her master didn't tell anyone the truth, since he was actually very strong. Before answering, Yulman took a sip of tea. He lowered his head and explained with sadness in his voice. When power goes beyond people's understanding, they begin to fear and try to please in every possible way. The apostle remembered the days when he had defeated entire armies of monsters single-handedly, and at that time everyone had stayed away from him. Grateful people fell to their knees, right on the ground soaked in enemy blood, and greeted the first apostle Yulman. One day he noticed a beautiful girl who was bowing at his feet. Yulman, flashing a smile from under his deep hood, invited the beautiful stranger to admire the moon with him. But she, with tears in her eyes, frightened by the greatness of the guy, did not respond to the invitation. Yulman looked at her with disappointment. His hand dropped lifelessly. Then Sylph asked if her master had any acquaintances like himself. The apostle replied that they had been, but they had been traveling for a very long time and it was not known where they were now. Despite everything, Yulman raised his head and smiled, even blushed a little. Now he felt like an ordinary person, the same as everyone else. The sword spirit wondered if there were any misunderstandings between the master and the common people. On the streets of the academy, students were already gossiping about the Fire Witch's new protege. There were even suggestions that they were just a couple. The guy with the piercing gaze denied it, because he personally saw the mark of the master and the student on his forehead. His interlocutor, with no less venom in his voice, replied that only a loving couple could engrave the mark directly on the forehead. Aisha listened to these conversations, and in her soul, surprise and sadness were increasingly mixed. It was getting dark, and lights were coming on in the windows of the student dormitories. Sierra walked down the hallway carrying a tray with a bun and tea. She remembered that she had forgotten to remove the magic seal from the entrance, and what only a stupid student could learn during this time. Walking up to the door, she ran her hand over the seal, removing it. Upon entering, she asked how Lou was doing but found a curious sight. Her lazy student not only didn't study, he lay on little Sylph's lap while she stroked his head. A random student passing by Yulman's window jumped aside from the sudden flash of fire reflected in the glass. It was the angry Sierra who taught Yulman a lesson. who now sat on his knees with the spirit of Excalibur and asked the master for forgiveness. Charlotte had not yet seen Sylph, and now she asked with interest if she was the same sword spirit. The girl bowed down, introduced herself, and asked the witch to become her mentor. Charlotte's eyes widened at the sound of a sweet voice. She immediately noted her prettiness as soon as she saw the girl, while Yulman cast surprised glances at both of them. To hide her embarrassment, Sierra coughed into her fist and said that she had come to tell them about her participation in the capital's magical congress, which would take place in a week. Yulman rolled his eyes and asked who came up with the name, since it sounded too saccharine. Sierra's face turned darker than a cloud. The next moment, Yulman sat with a bump on the back of his head, while Sylph waved a notebook in front of his face like a fan, asking for forgiveness for her lack of restraint. The witch sat on the chair in front of them, crossing her legs, talking about how the management had no plans to take them there. Everything changed because no one could have imagined that Lou would get his hands on the Smith family's Excalibur, and that a spirit of the sword would emerge from it. Sylph stood up and began to pace the room restlessly. The teacher stood up, crossing her arms over her chest, and continued that this was precisely why the organizers of the Magical Congress had reluctantly decided to invite them. If they refused, the children's entourage could be in danger. Yulman was silent, thinking about what was said. Sierra said seriously, "The majority in Congress will want to put pressure on Lou." He smiled, assuring that his master had nothing to worry about, because who knows who will give it to whom next. The sound of daggers and various types of weapons that the students wielded could be heard from everywhere. During the training fight, Aisha reliably parried her opponent's blows. She jumped to the side from another attack and grouped herself correctly so as not to fall. The vice principal, who was watching the students, announced the end of the sparring and allowed them to rest a little. The witch stepped aside, wiping her face with a handkerchief. Behind him, conversations began again. Many had not seen Kyle for a long time. A group of guys discussed how it was because of his conflict with Lou, and now Kyle was facing off against the Fire Witch herself. They had no idea that Lou was picking on powerful people. Aisha immediately became sad when she heard gossip about her friend. At that moment, a male figure appeared at the entrance to the training hall. The girl looked in that direction with hope. It was Yulman, who heard all the talk about himself. He looked up at the gossips and said that during his absence from training there had been too many annoying flies here. Groups of students suddenly began to scurry about, as if remembering that the deputy director was calling them and they needed to leave immediately. Sarah was surprised by the sudden appearance of students near her. Aisha ran up to her friend and asked why he came here. He pulled a rose out of his inside jacket pocket and handed it to the girl, saying that he had come to visit his charming and beautiful Aisha. She blushed and lowered her eyes and replied that Sylph and teacher Sierra were the ones who were beautiful and charming. Yulman was very surprised by these words. The witch, having accepted the flower from the boy, sadly explained, she heard the students talking about Lou's trip to the capital's magical congress. The apostle smoothed his hair, nodding meaningfully. Theatrically running his hand over the back of his head, he asked Aisha not to be bored in his absence. Arya, who had come up to him with an axe in her hands, ruined the moment. They hadn't seen each other for only a few days, but no matter how much you feed the wolf, he still looks at the forest. Yulman, putting his hands in his pockets, cheerfully asked his friend if she had already received a scolding during sparring today, to which the girl almost attacked him with her fists. The upset Aisha was still quite amused by her classmates' squabble. On the tower of the academy, the flag of the educational institution fluttered in the brisk wind. Yulman and Sylph stood in the square near a large carriage drawn by several white horses. An angry Sierra looked out of the carriage window and called out to the boys, ordering them not to delay their departure. The apostle turned around and replied that this morning he wanted to have time to say goodbye to his dear Aisha. Sylph added that she checked, and it seemed the girl was not in the room. The boy wanted to say something to the teacher, but she interrupted him. Holding the curtain, she said sharply that the student had 3 seconds to get into the carriage. Yulman did not dare to disobey his master, so after a few seconds, Aisha watched from her window with a tremor in her chest as the carriage disappeared into the distance. She said Yulman's name with sadness. She was not alone in the room. A black shadow from the magical heavenly portal called her. Aisha, without turning around, understood who was addressing her. The shadow said that now there is no one strong left who could protect this academy, so in the evening she can begin the task given to her by the master. The witch obediently agreed. Shadow noticed what was happening to the girl and voiced her guess. A guy named Lou loves Aisha very much. This can greatly anger the master. Then, the witch turned around for the first time and desperately asked not to tell her father and mother about Lou. The shadow giggled evilly. Everything would depend on whether Aisha could cope with the task. On the way to the event, Sierra told her companions about what awaited them. The annual Capital Magical Congress was held in turn by the three main clans: Smith, Jones, Isis. This Congress was the main identical gathering of the world of magicians, where the best of them gathered to discuss achievements and, in general, just to communicate. Propping his cheek on his fist, Yulman announced his discovery. It turns out that the Smith family is one of the three main clans, but Charlotte cut him off, warning him not to underestimate them because the Smiths are the descendants of the Empire's founding heroes, second only in status to the Imperial family. Sylph did not participate in the conversation, her head down. She was thinking about something of her own. The witch continued. The Isis clan controls most of the Empire's military forces and has outstanding magical skills. The guy thoughtfully threw his hands behind his head and leaned back on the soft seat, asking what the Jones clan was famous for. His mentor, with the same severity in her voice, replied that this clan had colonized most of the Empire's trade routes and the pharmaceutical industry, and also owned enormous wealth. The apostle chuckled. It felt like the royal family of this empire had no control over anything at all. Sierra urged him to be careful because this time the magical congress was being organized by the Jones clan. Yulman chuckled. What was he afraid of? It was just participation in a banquet. He abruptly changed the topic to something more pleasant, turning to the spirit of the sword. There would be a lot of delicious dishes at the banquet. They would definitely need to eat their fill. Sylph nodded in agreement in response. The witch sighed in disappointment. No changes. Still, she thought, there was one problem with the Jones clan that would be difficult to solve. A few days later, they successfully reached the capital of the Guam Empire. The Congress was held in a mansion in front of which a large fountain was installed. The butler approached the carriage door and bowed, announcing that they had arrived at the Jones clan estate. Sierra was the first to get out of the carriage. She was immediately met by the clan's maid, bowing and greeting. The butler thanked the witch for coming, saying that the owner had been waiting for her at the meeting place for a long time. Sierra snapped back, frowning, that the man could tell the owner not to bother, since she still had things to do. He became embarrassed, reminding the girl of the special attitude of the owner of the estate towards her. Charlotte gave him a look that spoke volumes. The butler squeaked something and did not dare to say anything else. The witch informed Yulman that he could come in with Sylph and find a place to rest, while she herself would report to Director Aces about her arrival. Charlotte added that the boys should be as quiet as possible. She wanted to say a specific name, but hesitated. Then she shook her head and said it didn't matter. The apostle glanced at her in surprise, but the witch waved him off. The witch asked the maid to show her companions the way, and she bowed respectfully. The girl pointed towards the estate and invited the guests to follow her. The student stood thoughtfully as Charlotte walked away. He turned around and looked at the girl's figure, realizing that she was not telling him something. The maid led the guests to the large gates of the estate, inviting them to enter. Inside, everything sparkled and shone. The expensive furnishings screamed about the wealth of the owners. Large tables with snow-white tablecloths were laden with food. Guests in incredibly presentable outfits walked around importantly. Yulman and Sylph looked around, looking for something more delicious to choose from. They were not at all interested in the exquisite furnishings of the hall. A passing lady covered herself with a fan in disgust, complaining that two important magicians from the Smith and Isis families had not arrived, but the city people had managed to get through and were now eating and drinking at someone else's expense. Meanwhile, the couple had already filled their plates with real langousts from the deepest depths, fillet steaks, and were enthusiastically commenting on their catch, loudly chomping. Suddenly, the sound of clattering dishes was heard. Someone pushed the maid right onto the table with desserts, loudly calling her a worthless piece of work. It was the owner of the estate who was taking out his anger on the servants because they had not brought him Sierra as he had ordered. The poor girl's eyes filled with tears. A wound formed on her cheek from the fall. She could not say a word in her defense. The butler gloated and announced to the owner that he had repeated the order to Luina to deliver the girl several times, but she had dared to disobey. The apostle, calmly eating from his plate, commented on what he saw, addressing the spirit of the sword. These manipulations are called playing dice. The man turned around abruptly, hearing unfamiliar voices, and frowned, realizing that he was seeing these guests for the first time. His gaze immediately counted the strangers. Full plates of food, sloppy clothes. This meant only one thing. Commoners had snuck into the estate to eat for free. The man, with feigned politeness like a cat, slowly approached the strangers, calling them dear guests. He introduced himself, indicating that he represented the Jones family, the hosts of today's event, and asked to see the special invitations that would admit guests. The apostle answered directly that they had no invitations. The crowd that had gathered around began to buzz with discontent. Were the guards really eating their bread in vain? It was from young people like these, who didn't know etiquette, that the empire ceased to be what it used to be. The man dropped his feigned friendliness and immediately shouted for the guys to leave the banquet immediately. Sylph, without letting go of the plate, looked at him angrily. It seemed that she was just waiting for the owner's command to teach the impudent fellow a lesson. Yulman gently pushed her away and apologized for the misunderstanding, saying that they came here with Master Charlotte, so they did not have invitations with them. But the clan representative became even more angry, lamenting that this was nonsense, and his Sierra, so beautiful and outstanding, could not take such as they as students. At this attack, the apostle was surprised that the man called the teacher his own. Those present came to life again. A lady from the crowd whispered to her neighbor that the owner Anthony was still pursuing the fire witch. Only it was a pity that she did not reciprocate his feelings at all. A man standing nearby replied that he had heard about Sierra's new student. The owner almost burst with rage after this news. The lady standing next to the maid broke into a sly smile. This brunette does not know who he is talking to by saying that he is her student. He signed his own death warrant. Yulman waved his fork, saying that if Anthony didn't believe him, he should ask the butler who had just met them with Master Sierra. The man immediately brushed off his words, replying that the guy was joking, since Mrs. Sierra was met by the maid Loina. This caused the owner to have another fit of rage. Clenching his fists, he began to mock Yulman, saying that he was not fit to be Charlotte's student. The witch's commanding voice was heard throughout the hall. She appeared in the doorway and loudly objected to what had been said. The crowd parted and fell silent, letting the guests through and watching her greedily. Sierra folded her arms across her chest, not at all embarrassed by this reception, and confirmed that the boy had become her student. Anthony laughed awkwardly, saying that he had made a mistake in his judgment and that he felt embarrassed. He approached the witch and bowed, saying that he wanted to make amends by showing her the achievements of magic this year. She shook her head and refused. Then Charlotte grabbed the elbow of Yulman, who was standing next to her. The boy shuddered, looking at the teacher with confusion. The red-haired witch smiled and, without letting go of the apostle's hand, blurted out that she and her fiancé would see everything themselves, causing shock in Yulman. Not only the student was amazed, everyone around him began to look at each other in bewilderment. Anthony stuttered and asked the girl what she was talking about. Sierra, still smiling, confirmed that the guy was not only her student, but also her fiancé, tugging Yulman's hand to make him play along. He turned his head towards her and quickly asked in a whisper what was going on. Charlotte answered him just as quietly that the Jones clan had used their influence to marry her off several times, and now that the opportunity had presented itself, the girl would force them to abandon the idea. Yulman didn't need to be told twice. He, like Charlotte, smiled radiantly and agreed with the idea of looking together at the achievements of magic. Anthony, looking gloomy as a storm cloud, blurted out that it was very short-sighted of the witch to get involved with the poor and refuse his advances. The butler tried to bring his master to his senses, reminding him that today was the day of the Congress, and all the eyes of high society were on them. He then looked at the couple with a sardonic expression, saying that he had heard that Miss Sierra had no magical accomplishments to show for this convention. Anthony grinned, pleased to hear this. He tried to diffuse the situation by inviting everyone present to try his latest development, a magical medicine. Loud claps from the crowd could be heard from all around. The maids entered the hall in an orderly row, carrying plates in their hands on which stood small glasses with the potion. A bright blue drink splashed in a small container with every step the servant took. Yulman cast an attentive glance in that direction. The guests, having tried their portions, began to whisper in admiration, evaluating the potion. It tasted slightly bitter, but even the smallest sip completely replenishes spiritual strength. Anthony smiled and thanked him for the approval, because this was the result of the Jones family's developments over the course of the year, a concentrated spirit replenishment potion. Then he turned over his shoulder at the uninvited guests, and as if by chance said that some people show up at the Congress, eat and drink, without having any magical achievements. That is the real shame. The man winked at Sierra, asking if she agreed with him. Yulman grinned. An idea came to him. The guy demonstratively knocked over the cup of potion. It spilled onto the expensive parquet floor in front of the stunned crowd. The owner gasped for air, outraged by such an act. At this, the apostle chuckled and apologized. His hand just shook. Charlotte couldn't help but burst into laughter. Anthony, his eyes wide, pounced on Yulman with accusations. He poured out a potion brewed in ideal proportions, and how many rare ingredients were used? The guy, rolling the cup in his hands, calmly listed all the ingredients: shining stone powder, basilisk scales, angelica, and the purest water from under the polar ice. The shocked man stared at Yulman, speechless from what he heard. Yulman didn't stop. He continued mockingly that he could make a box of this stuff in a day, and Anthony also called this potion the latest development with ideal proportions. As if wound up, Anthony shouted that he had worked hard for a whole month to create this potion, had achieved the perfect balance, and the scoundrel dared to say with his dirty mouth that it was swill, then let him make a box of the potion today, as he had promised. Sierra immediately approached the student, calling him stupid and scolding him for his big mouth, but he calmed her down. He whispered that he needed the girl's help in some matters. She listened and agreed. Charlotte then asked how he knew the ingredients and how to make the potion, to which the apostle hesitated for a moment. The faithful spirit of the sword came to his aid, quickly blurting out that it was she who had suggested all the ingredients to the owner. Yulman laughed with relief. That was exactly how it all happened. The Fire Witch thought for a moment, since the girl was part of Excalibur, it was no wonder that she could sniff out the ingredients of a potion by its scent. While behind Sierra's back, Yulman and Sylph high-fived each other for their teamwork. One of the long tables was cleared especially for the apostle, and ingredients, a knife, a board, and cooking utensils were left there. Anthony addressed the guy mockingly, supported by the laughter of the crowd, shining stone powder, carrots, chestnuts, sorurus. So many products from the market. Is he really ready to prepare a potion for everyone? Yulman answered him with a meaningful look. He effectively threw off his cloak and, remaining in just his shirt, tied an apron around his waist as if he did this every day. The guy heated up the vat and added more fire for a better effect. Literally a few minutes later, a potion was already splashing in the container, no different in color or consistency from what Anthony had been brewing for so long. Those present inhaled the aromas emanating from the vat with full lungs, commenting on what they felt. Such a pure smell, as if you were transported to nature and so serene in the heart. The man denied everything, because cooking was not that simple. Some special waves emanated from Yulman, who was confident in his abilities and stood in the center of the table next to the boiling vat. The liquid in the cauldron looked truly impressive. There was no doubt that this was the legendary potion. The audience was amazed by the skill of the young magician. Meanwhile, Yulman was already pouring portions of the steaming liquid into glass containers. The potion, like spring water, shimmered in the facets of the glass. Finally, the apostle asked everyone to come to the table. The potion was already ready. The first to approach him was a stately, unfamiliar man who politely asked if he could try the potion. Sierra greeted the man who approached her respectfully. It was Professor Madeline himself from the Imperial University of Potioneering. He was known on par with the chief magician aces. Yulman smiled good-naturedly and nodded. The professor held the glass in both hands and took a leisurely sip, savoring every sip. At first, his face showed no emotion. But a moment passed and his eyes widened. Madeline exclaimed in shock that he would never have thought that he would meet a person who would make a superpower potion. Anthony asked in shock, wasn't the superpower potion, which increases spiritual power several times, lost almost 300 years ago? The man, still not believing what he had just learned, agreed. But he himself had never heard of such a method of preparing the potion. So how could this young man learn the secret of its preparation? He put the empty cup on the table. Then he bowed to Yulman, saying that he would give half of everything he had to learn how to create this potion. There was silence as the boy thought about the words he had said. The apostle smiled slyly. Only half? The professor nodded and promised to add more if it wasn't enough. Some gentlemen exclaimed that this would be a huge sum, because for this magic potion lost many years ago, any money invested could be returned. Anthony gritted his teeth. He was beside himself with anger. He exclaimed that his clan Jones was also offering half of their wealth for the recipe for this potion. The old professor stared at the man in amazement. He stood there, proudly erect, because he knew that the Jones clan's fortune was much greater than anyone else's, and this guy would not be able to resist such a temptation. Yulman, picking his ear with his finger, told the men that he had no plans to sell the recipe. He grabbed his cloak and turned to Sierra, saying that since they had already looked at the achievements of magic, they could return. The desperate owner shouted after him that he was adding a share of the potion sales to half of his wealth. The apostle immediately pricked up his ears. Yulman stopped. He really was going to refuse this money. The guy's eyes sparkled with anticipation. There really was a lot of money. Sylph jumped with delight along with him. Charlotte, for the umpteenth time, sighed in disappointment. Well, who would have doubted it? Anthony took them to his office and invited them to a long table. On it stood a box with 3 richly decorated spatial rings. He said that the required amount of money was already placed in them. This could be checked. The servant took the box in his hands and brought it to the guests, telling them that after the potion began to be sold, their share would be transferred annually to the account of these rings. Anthony leaned forward and, anticipating hearing the secret of preparation, asked how the potion was prepared. Yulman took a crumpled piece of paper out of his pocket, casually threw it on the table, and replied that the energy contained in a magic potion was never obtained from the ingredients themselves, but was drawn from the curdling of elements contained in the air. The man, not expecting such an answer, grimaced in annoyance and leaned back in his chair. The apostle unfolded a piece of paper with a drawing on it and explained that a magic circle was engraved in the vat that could curl the elements of air. Using higher fire magic allows one to successfully cause resonance between the magic circle and the ingredients. As for the ingredients themselves, low-level ingredients have a fairly low elemental content. So in the magic circle, they interact with the highly concentrated air elements, seeping through and filling the void. Low-level ingredients not only improve the coagulation results, they also improve the quality of the elements, which would be more difficult with complex ingredients. Anthony, greedily peering at the drawing on the sheet, let out a cry of victory. Sierra, clutching a cup in her hands, said that since the Jones clan had learned the secret of the potion, they had no reason to linger here. The man objected. There was still one more matter they needed to discuss. He asked if Charlotte was aware of the recent eruption of Mount Laertes. The witch nodded, confirming what was said. Just a natural disaster, nothing interesting. But Anthony, smiling, said that he thought so too when the clan sent a rescue team there, until they accidentally discovered traces of a rare magical beast in a mountain cave. A fire unicorn. Sierra hung her head, her eyes wide at what she heard. Yulman knew that fire unicorns did not live in the east, and asked how the beast ended up in the west. The interlocutor nodded, although it is unknown how the unicorn ended up in their area, but it can be said with certainty that it protects the raging fire of a precious stone. Yulman leaned forward with interest when he heard about the stone. Anthony explained that this gem was probably the untold wealth from Eastern myths, so his clan was sending a group to find the stone, so it can be assumed that Sierra would want to join them. The man folded his arms across his chest and offered a deal. When it was all over, the unicorn would go to Charlotte and the stone would go to the clan. The witch surprisingly quickly agreed and asked when the group was leaving. Anthony stood up from the table, setting a deadline of 3 days, and suggested that the guests stay at the estate, as it was necessary to prepare well before the campaign. Yulman smiled at his own thoughts. He had long wanted to see what kind of stone it was. When the strangers left the office, the butler turned to the owner. Not only did he give half of his fortune for the recipe for a potion that guy could make in no time, but he also told about the fire unicorn. This would surely end badly for the clan. Anthony chuckled. He only suggested that they go there, but no one said that Charlotte and her team would be able to return back. The butler clapped his hands and admired what an excellent strategist his master turned out to be. The maid led the guests down a long corridor and stopped at an unremarkable door. She apologized that because of the congress that had been convened these days, all the rooms were occupied and only one was free. Sierra replied angrily that this one would do and dismissed the maid. Yulman carefully placed Excalibur on the table in the room. With his hands behind his head, he asked the teacher why they were taking the unicorn and not the gem. The girl replied that from the heart of a unicorn one can obtain blood that can transform any fire obtained by fire magic into an all-consuming heavenly flame. And by drinking it, one can awaken its natural magic. The apostle cast an interested glance at her. Turning around, the fire witch told Yulman that she had taken him on as an apprentice, only so that he could help her deal with the fire unicorn. She walked to the bed and sat down on the soft bed. The corners of the girl's lips turned down. She regretted that she had acted selfishly. Yulman agreed with her words. Sierra looked at the floor in shock. She didn't expect the student to support her self-flagellation. But he immediately began to speak again, putting his hands in his favorite pockets. A sly smile played across the guy's face. He said that truly selfish people never face a choice, and he personally wants both the stone and the unicorn. The girl smiled and blushed. What a stupid student she got. She quickly collected her thoughts, became serious again and thought out loud. In 3 days it would be necessary to leave, but now Lou was still weak for this. To prevent something irreparable from happening to her student, all that remains is to transfer part of her magical powers to him. She sat back down on the bed and patted the hand next to her, inviting him to sit down and show her the boy's seal on his forehead. Yulman sat down next to Sierra and pulled her bangs away from her forehead, opening access to the seal, not noticing how the girl blushed. The next moment she jerked the guy's head towards her, burying his face right into her thighs. That's where her seal was located. Charlotte exhaled, passing her powers onto her student, and her entire body became illuminated with a bright white glow. Streams of light began to form around the couple, forming large runes on the floor. Holding the boy's head tightly, she let out another long breath and ordered Lu not to move. A little later, when the ritual was over, she woke up and, looking to the side, quickly spoke. Here it is, this ancient method of transmitting magical powers through the seal between the master and the student. Now, having received her powers, the student can use her fire magic. She stumbled, lowered her head, and, screaming, realized that the guy was still lying on her thigh, not moving. Yulman slowly rose, holding his head. He leaned back on the bed, drowsily replying that he was very comfortable. Anthony sat at the table in his office and asked the butler about what the guests had been doing for 3 days. He replied that they had not even left the room. Moreover, screams could be heard from there from time to time. The master banged on the table, ordering the servant to be silent. He sat up straight in his chair, exclaiming that he didn't understand how he was any worse than this brunette. Sierra is simply blind and does not see all the advantages. Suddenly, there was a scraping sound of cutlery on a plate and a voice from the opposite end of the table. A stranger assured that the gentleman should not worry. Anthony looked puzzled at the man with the hood that hid his handsome features and long white hair and apologized for his tactlessness. He, smiling, asked if Anthony had called him to resolve the issue with his fellow travelers. The stranger was the traveler of the void, Hasadan, one of the 4 best magicians of the Empire, who was considered the only person in history to enter the world of the void. At this time, Sierra continued to teach her student her own magical abilities. Right now, Lu was holding a clod of fire in his palm and asking the master if he was doing everything right. The witch nodded and added that now he could freely use internal magic. Yulman was a little scared and stepped back when the light flared brighter right in front of his face. He couldn't even imagine that it was possible to control fire in this way. Now he wasn't afraid that the flame could break out. Sierra thoughtfully rubbed her chin, either addressing her student or calming herself, while Yulman drew hearts from the flames behind her back. They didn't need any incidents during the taming of the unicorn, so the transferred magical powers should be enough to withstand fatal blows. The main thing is not to forget that the powers must be spent wisely. Looking over her shoulder and seeing the sensible use of energy, Charlotte cursed under her breath. The maid's voice was heard behind the door. She asked to hurry because the carriage to Mount Laertes was already ready. They could leave at any moment. Sierra immediately threw the door open, appearing in front of the girl along with a soot-covered Lu. Suddenly, the witch caught a glimpse of the familiar hem of a cloak out of the corner of her eye, which disappeared around the corner. Yulman noticed the teacher's hesitation and now looked at her questioningly, while Charlotte was surprised to see this man. But she decided that she was mistaken, so she waved her hand and hurried the student. Late in the evening, a chase through the narrow corridors of St. Joseph's Tower took place. A small figure, wrapped in a thick cloak, maneuvered, trying to hide from its pursuers. But the last turn turned out to be a dead end. Judging by the sounds in the distance, they were about to overtake her. The figure raised its head, staring at the wall, and began breathing loudly, trying to calm its breathing, which had been ragged from running. Sarah gave a triumphant cry when she saw the stranger hesitate and shouted at her that there was no way out, so she should give back what she had stolen. The woman, drawing magical runes in the air, demanded that this be done immediately. Magic chains quickly approached the figure, ready to bind it at any moment. The stranger turned around, her face hidden by a mask and long blonde hair. She jumped up, dodging the chains. Then she suddenly moved to the side and, breaking the window, jumped out into the darkness of the night. Luckily, the fall was not high, and the girl landed on the ground immediately. The deputy director rushed to the window and looked down. Clenching her fists, she cursed. The stranger had managed to escape anyway. The figure, meanwhile, did not go far, hiding just around the bend. The stranger turned out to be none other than Aisha. She pulled the mask off her face and breathed a sigh of relief, taking a carved white box from her bosom. She finally got it. A few days later, at the foot of the fiery Mount Laertes, a party of Jones and Sierra's men and crew rode forward in wagons drawn by white horses, the drivers urging the reins on every now and then. Suddenly, an order was heard from one of the crews to stop. Anthony growled in his carriage, again. Yulman jumped out of the neighboring cart like a bullet, covering his mouth with both hands. The others had to go outside too. Anthony looked at Sierra reproachfully and said that they could have warned Lu about the condition of the road, because due to constant stops, this one-day trip stretched out into several days. The witch awkwardly scratched her cheek. She herself didn't know that the guy would feel so bad after the trip along the mountain path. The apostle, having emptied his stomach, now walked, staggering, along the road to the carriage, thinking that more than anything in the world he did not want to return there. Suddenly, distant screams caught his attention. Sierra and Anthony turned in the same direction at the same time. One of the clan's team was running towards the company, followed by whirlwind lizards, huge reptiles with many spikes on their backs. Anthony did not move from his place and said authoritatively that there was nothing to be afraid of a couple of monsters, because they had high-class magicians with them. The boy stuttered and objected, because there were too many lizards. Sierra looked closer and realized that this was indeed the case. A whole flock of whirlwind lizards was now running towards them. Yulman perked up and reacted to this news with undisguised admiration. Anthony screamed, convinced that there were too many reptiles. He cursed the mercenaries, shouting that he had called them to kill the unicorn, not to disturb the lair of the whirlwind lizards. The fact was that these terrifying monsters were mid-low-level magical beasts that moved at incredible speeds and sprayed poison from their teeth. The man tried to calm those present. These lizards should not be feared, but now there really are too many of them. Fighting with them would waste a lot of energy. They need to come up with a way to have less contact with the monsters while the hunt for the unicorn is underway. He waved his hand towards the crew, ordering the squad to take their places to escape from the lizards. One of the mercenaries interrupted him, pointing his finger to the side. An incredible scene appeared before the leader of the squad. Yulman was stroking the beast like an affectionate cat, while the lizard leaned its front paws on his chest. Anthony, not believing his eyes, asked Sierra if her fiancé was familiar with these creatures. She waved her hands, smiling awkwardly. The witch explained that Lu's ability to deal with magical beasts exceeded that of ordinary people. Then the man suggested to the apostle that he ask the flock to move aside a little so that he could continue on his way. Waving away the persistent licking, Yulman grinned. He had a better idea. The roar of powerful paws on rocks filled the entire space of the mountain. Now the people have saddled the swirling lizards, leaving the coachman behind to guard the carriages. Anthony shouted irritably at Yulman that this was a dubious undertaking. But the apostle joyfully replied that this method of transportation was very fast and convenient. He laughed, holding onto the lizard's horn with one hand. Sierra, watching him, allowed herself to smile. She even liked the student like this. Finally, the strange procession approached the foot of the volcano Laertes. People jumped off their makeshift horses. Anthony pointed to the entrance to the cave. That's where they found the unicorn. It was clear that the stone at the entrance was covered in blood. Suddenly, one of the whirlwind lizards stuck out its tongue and hissed loudly. Looking in that direction, Yulman immediately became wary. He scratched his chin thoughtfully. It seemed like there really was something inside. The guy released a flock of lizards who, clinging to the ground, obeyed the order. Sierra was the first to step fearlessly towards the cave. The rest of the travelers followed her. The company moved slowly along the stone corridor. A man from the squad stepped forward, lighting the way with a gas lamp. Anthony looked at Lu's back. He would never have thought that this guy could get along so well with wild animals. He smiled wickedly, because even if they tamed the unicorn, Sierra and her student would not survive today. Finally, the procession approached the through exit into the main part of the cave where the unicorn lived. Coming out of the corridor, they found themselves on the edge of a cliff. The deadly burning lava was bubbling and seething, trying to spill over the edge. Everyone screamed in unison at what they saw. It seemed as if there was nothing around except a stream of fiery liquid. Suddenly, a bright glow caught everyone's attention. The man exclaimed that he saw treasure. Nearby, washed by lava on one side, the very same stone lay in the rocks. Violet-pink in color, it beckoned travelers to it. Yulman tensed up. The stone was unusual. It trembled periodically, and these movements seemed familiar to the guy. Anthony muttered happily, stepping forward, that since there was no fire unicorn, it meant there was an opportunity to grab the stone. But he didn't notice how the lava began to bubble even more, spitting out bright bubbles around him. The fire witch cast a wary glance in that direction. Suddenly, she rushed towards Anthony, holding out her hands to him, and ordered him to stop. Right in front of them, a huge fireball burst out of the gorge. The man raised his head and, with his mouth open, watched his movement. His legs suddenly gave way and he fell to the floor, moving back as a huge clawed paw stepped onto the edge of the ravine. A fiery unicorn, completely engulfed in fire, slowly crawled towards the squad with its mouth open. It was a magical beast of a rare level. It came from the eastern continent, was a master of fire attacks, and was also deadly strong. The mercenaries stood in stances, holding their magic wands out in front of them, ready to attack at any moment. Sierra, while creating magical runes in front of her, quickly said that this fire unicorn was a rare magical beast. Although its killing power was not as high as that of natural disaster-level beasts, it would not give up easily. Then the girl ordered the student to wait aside, and if there was a chance, he could use his talent for taming. The apostle thought that the master was right. Unicorns have a stubborn character. If you tame one, the creature can resist, and it is better for him not to show his magic in front of this whole crowd. Yulman threw up his hands. Ordinary people would not be able to comprehend his power. The unicorn slowly advanced on the still-lying Anthony, who, trembling, hysterically ordered his squad to get rid of the beast. The warriors pointed their staffs forward, calling out the command, "Ice Coffin!" Blocks of ice rained down on the dragon from all sides. Having surrounded the unicorn, they, led by their master, tried to block the beast. For a moment it seemed as if the dragon was trapped in snow. The beast became angry. His eyes flashed dangerously. Powerful streams of fire gushed from the beast's body. No matter how strong the mercenary's magic was, it still couldn't withstand the fire's onslaught. There was an explosion, pieces of ice flew in all directions, and the dragon found itself free. The wounded mercenaries were breathing heavily, bent at the knees. The unicorn, unfazed by anything, ran forward again, preparing to attack the people. The detachment, seeing this, hurried in horror to escape from the monster's sight. At that very moment, the beast's horn collided with the magic sword with a ringing sound. Sierra wasted no time in rushing forward, now using her weapon to block his attack. The animal narrowed its eyes dangerously, growling even louder. It moved its head to the side, trying to push the sword away from the horn. Sierra felt her grip weaken in horror, the sword in her hands moving to the side. The unicorn let out a roar and turned its head sharply, trying to throw off the annoying opponent. There was a powerful explosion from the collision. The fire witch was thrown back several meters. The sword remained in her hands. The stone that the people had come for shook dangerously from the force of the blow. He was lying right on the edge of a cliff, so a push of such force predictably provoked the stone to move, and it, jumping up, almost fell right into the flow of seething lava. Anthony watched in horror as his treasure disappeared into the raging fire. The unicorn turned around and rushed in that direction. But the stone didn't have time to land in the lava. Yulman reacted with lightning speed and in 2 counts found himself in the air, holding the prey tightly above his head. The warriors' mouths dropped open as they watched this. A few moments later, the apostle landed on solid ground. Sierra immediately ran up to him, worried, saying that the stone contained a raging flame, so he needed to be careful. The stone in Yulman's hands heated up. He screamed, and an enraged unicorn immediately appeared behind his back. Anthony clenched his fists. If this continued, the guy would end up with both the stone and the unicorn. The apostle turned around with a smile and said that the Jones clan had been wrong from the start. It was not a precious stone. Yulman didn't have time to finish telling the story before a portal formed in the air right behind him. Sharply increasing in size, huge gray tentacles began to flow out of it. The shoots approached Charlotte and Yulman with lightning speed. The guy turned around abruptly, hearing an unusual sound. He pushed Charlotte aside sharply. The girl didn't have time to turn around, and her student was already tightly grasped by tentacles and pulled into the portal. Time dragged on like an eternity, and then the witch watched the figure disappear into the dark matter. She leaned forward and screamed at the top of her lungs. Following Lou, the tentacles tightly grasped the fire unicorn. The animal could only growl from powerlessness. Sierra froze in shock at what she saw. She realized that this was the wasteland of Hasidan. Anthony gave the order to his squad to attack the unicorn. Pointing his hand in its direction, the warriors immediately obeyed. The unicorn, which was already being pulled into the portal by the tentacles that were firmly clinging to its body, was now being hit by a multitude of ice fragments. Events developed so quickly that Sierra could not fully come to her senses. The dragon was covered with snow dust and even more fragments. When the icy fog cleared, the beast was free of Hasidan's bonds, but was now pinned to the stone wall by blocks of ice. The fire witch rushed to Anthony, bombarding him with questions about what was going on, and he, smiling broadly, laughed at the girl's naivety and said that he had no intention of cooperating with her at all. With resentment in his voice, the man shouted about Charlotte's unwillingness to become related to him, although she had promised earlier, and at the Congress she and the boy made him look like a complete idiot and disgraced him in front of the guests. The villain's face twisted into a cruel grin. The Jones clan had already suffered enough from Murderbell. It was time to pay the bills. It was not for nothing that he called the master of the wasteland to deal with Sierra and her student. Charlotte gritted her teeth in anger at herself. She had definitely seen Hasidan in the corridor then. Holding her sword out in front of her, Sierra warned that no one would leave here alive if anything happened to her student. At that moment, the portal moved and separated the witch from the others. Hasidan's voice was heard. He heard what the girl was saying. Then the Traveler of the Void himself emerged from the portal, grinning, replying that her student had already become lunch for the Master of the Wasteland. Charlotte's eyes widened in disbelief. All the ridiculous, sweet, and funny moments she had lived through with Lou flashed through her mind. Grief was replaced by anger. The witch swung her sword and rushed at her opponents, offering to pay them for the dinner with their lives. A magical fiery vortex formed behind her. Hasidan did not move. Putting his hand forward, he directed a portal at the girl. The gates of the wasteland. The whirlwind created by Charlotte for the attack was immediately sucked into the gate. She gritted her teeth, not believing that this was possible. The man ricocheted his own magic back at Sierra. The flashes of fire knocked her off her feet, and the girl lost her balance. However, she landed on one knee, covered in bruises, and now coughing raggedly. The mage stood there, chuckling, saying that the magic of the wasteland existed outside the basic framework of magic. Even the magic of the fire sword could not overcome it. His sharp gaze pierced from under the hood. The man advised not to make unnecessary movements but simply die. The traitor from Clan Jones asked sarcastically if it was too easy to let Y die like that. A trickle of blood ran from the corner of Sierra's lips as she listened carefully to the men's conversation, wondering what to do next. Gritting her teeth in pain, the witch analyzed what Hasidan had said. She had only one way left to overcome this supreme magic. Charlotte ran to the place where the unicorn, still motionless but still alive, was hanging. Anthony panicked when he saw where the witch was heading and shouted that Sierra needed to be stopped before she got to the unicorn's blood. Hasidan calmly replied that she was just wasting her energy. Then he chuckled meaningfully without saying anything. Meanwhile, Charlotte sat on the unicorn's lap, her palms under the wound from which blood was flowing, asking for forgiveness for the fact that she was going to take his powers. The wounded animal growled gutturally, unable to defend itself. The girl took a deep breath and quickly swallowed some blood. Something happened that she never expected. Falling on all fours, the witch began to cough violently. The sensation was comparable to that of her entire body being consumed by a fierce fire. There was nothing to breathe. It was as if my insides were being eaten away by heat. Hasidan slowly approached her, saying that Charlotte was too naive to believe the words of old man Aces, because from drinking blood she would only burn alive. Pressing her hand to her throat, the fire witch croaked that the director would not deceive her. The man chuckled, measuring her with his gaze. It seemed that the girl did not know Aces at all. Hasidan turned to the squad and said that if they killed the witch now, there might be an explosion of heavenly fire raging in Charlotte. So it would be better to leave her here, to die a natural death. The stone was in their hands anyway. The witch understood that she couldn't just let them leave, but how difficult it was to make every movement. But suddenly something changed. An unknown force lifted her above the ground. The space around her literally blazed with fire. The natural magic of the Thousand Lights Master has awakened. The men turned around in shock. This shouldn't have happened. With tears in her eyes, Sierra said that even after awakening her natural magic, she was still very saddened by the loss of her student. And therefore there is no point in expecting mercy. A bright, scorching flash hid the girl's figure from view. The magician immediately created a void field spell. But something was wrong. The Master of the Void did not answer him. Meanwhile, a fire dragon with its mouth wide open was flying towards where the men were standing. Anthony stepped back, not understanding what was happening or how the beast had appeared. It was as if a pillar of fire had burst forth from the depths of the earth, filling the entire space. Then there was a deafening explosion. After a few seconds, it became quiet and the dust from the destruction settled. Sierra's opponents lay on the ground, their clothes burnt and their bodies covered in multiple wounds. Hasidan, unable to move, could not even imagine that someone could master the magic of heavenly fire. The fire witch landed softly on the ground. She was not at all happy about receiving the natural magic she so desired. Suddenly, claps were heard in the caves, the sound passing through the walls like the moon. The witch looked sharply towards the entrance. To her surprise, the director of the academy, Aces, slowly entered the cave. He stopped, holding his hands behind his back, and asked the girl if she had awakened her natural magic. She nodded, noticing that the director looked strange. Still lying on the ground, Hasidan laughed with difficulty, saying that this old man had been waiting from the very beginning for the day when the witch would awaken the natural magic. All this, none other than the demon kidnapper. Charlotte didn't believe what she was hearing and stared with all her eyes at the director, who was so familiar to her. According to legend, 500 years ago a monster appeared that could steal natural magic from people, and for 200 years there was no one who could defeat it. But the chronicles say that after the battle with the seventh apostle Sarlia, the demon disappeared without a trace. According to rumors, he had already died long ago. Who then was Director Aces all this time? Always so kind and sincere, the old man's face suddenly changed and he turned to Sierra. She said that if she could awaken her natural magic, the girl would help the director with many things. And since this was troublesome, she could think of another way out. The round glasses flashed playfully. The man asked what if he took her talent magic directly. Sierra screamed, not expecting such words from the director. Aces now looked nothing like his former self. He tensed up and suddenly grabbed his charge by the throat, lifting her into the air. It was a blow below the belt. Charlotte did not have time to react, and now greedily swallowed the air that was barely entering her lungs. And the man said such painful words, if he did not feel that she would be able to awaken the master of 1,000 fires, would he have raised her so carefully? He said with a laugh that Charlotte looked incredibly pathetic now. The essence of her existence is to awaken natural magic and allow Aces to take it away. The man was completely illuminated by light, his eyes wide open, as if he was drawing all the strength out of his former student with just one glance. The witch didn't believe that this was happening in reality. She croaked a quiet teacher, not understanding what hurt more, from his actions or from the lack of oxygen. The fire, and with it the power, slowly flowed from her body to the director. When the exchange was complete, the fire arced through the air and finally left the Sierra. Aces waited a few more moments. A second later, Charlotte was lying face down on the ground, easily creating a small cloud of fire in his palm. Aces exclaimed with delight how beautiful natural magic is. He folded his hands behind his back again and glanced at Sierra, saying that there was no point in keeping her alive now. Hasidan, deciding that it was better not to move, thought with horror that when the old man dealt with the witch, it would be his turn. But why had the Master of the Void not yet answered? At that moment, the air above the abyss split open. Aces cast a wary glance in that direction. Black cracks went straight through the air, growing larger with each passing second. Then a stream of air gushed out from there, almost knocking the demon off his feet. He immediately began to create runes in the air in order to attack if necessary. At first he could not see anything because of the thick cloud of dust, but soon a piece of a huge tentacle fell out of the crack, and then a male figure appeared. Yulman deftly jumped out of the abyss, holding a sword in his hand. He stepped hard on a piece of flesh. Aces froze. It couldn't be. Could this guy really deal with the strongest of the void world, its master himself? The apostle pushed away the tentacle with the toe of his boot, from which the blue liquid was flowing, and winced. Why does this octopus have so many tentacles? He just wasted his time. His gaze fixed on the director, immediately realizing that everything had not gone according to plan. But when the guy saw Sierra lying there with no signs of life, his eyes darkened. His master, covered in blood, did not move at all. Yulman's voice echoed throughout the cave as he asked who did this. Aces smiled into his beard and replied that it was he. Then he kicked the girl's body aside. The apostle lowered his head, assessing the teacher's injuries. He immediately asked if the director had taken away her natural magic. He agreed quite well and said that the guy should feel proud of his master, because it was she who had a hand in his future victory over the apostle. 300 years ago, in the battle with Sarlia, he realized that ordinary natural magic, no matter how much of it there was, would not be able to defeat the apostle. And so the demon needed even more power. The old man continued, his eyes wildly darting off into the distance, saying that he needed high-level magic and the energy left by the apostle to do this. So he spent his strength to teach Sierra and didn't reveal his true identity in order to obtain the apostle's energy. The man bent down and wiped a tear from the girl's closed eyelids. Then a lamp with a purple flame appeared in his hand, and the figure of the demon itself began to burn. Today was the day when he obtained both the highest level magic, the heavenly flame, and the energy of the apostle, the hellish flame. Aces laughed demonically because now, with many unique abilities, he was ready to fight the apostles again. But before that, he needs to deal with people, real scum. The apostle turned his attention to the unfortunate unicorn. Then he walked up to Sierra and knelt down on one knee, checking her pulse. At this time, Aces was already creating a magical fireball, loudly boasting that now heaven and hell were with him, so he didn't need anyone else. The demon threw a wave of fire into the air. Yulman asked mockingly if the old man really hoped for these splashes. Excalibur in his hands glowed a bright green. The apostle swung his sword and aimed it at the scorching magical waves. A tangible light passed right through them, and the next moment the flame died down. Only streams of air remained when the boy lowered his hand. Hasidan sat down on the ground, muttering that this man was really strong. Could he really be Sierra's disciple? Aces noticed Yulman's unusual abilities and asked who he was. because the guy didn't look like a person from a famous family at all, and could even use sylph. He smiled charmingly and asked to guess. A batch of rocks fell from the ceiling of the cave. Yulman broke loose and ran straight towards Asas, shouting as he went that if he guessed, he would receive a prize. The demon bared his teeth and began to summon the stolen magic. Spell runes formed at his feet. Yulman was already in the air and now swung his sword. The apostle swung, creating a soft green magical line around himself. He crashed to the ground, and space seemed to split into several parts again. A stream of incredible force now emanated from the sword, dangerously lifting up large pieces of rock. Yulman pointed his sword at Aces. The demon spread his arms, trying to hold back the whirlwind flying towards him. Lightning of the highest level magic emanated from the palms. Yulman hissed threateningly, knowing that Aces could hear him. If he doesn't guess, the old man will be punished. The two forces collided with a roar as the apostle ran towards the director. A deafening explosion occurred. Its echoes were of such a scale that they broke through the top of the cave, creating a large hole there. Hasidan looked up in concern. If they continued like this, the volcano might explode. The magician stood up staggering, cursing Aces and his opponent. He didn't care who survived. They wouldn't let him go alive anyway, so he had to run away from here. The demon coughed from the resulting cloud of dust. Yulman once again demanded that Sierra's natural magic be returned, but Asaces only laughed. The stolen magic of talent could not be returned. Blood was oozing from his torn clothes, but the demon seemed unfazed. He asked if the boy really thought he could defeat him. The man squeezed his palm and the glass lamp in it cracked, releasing a violet flame. Hasidan recoiled in shock. This was the fire of the underworld, belonging to the mythical apostle. What was the old man planning? Aces laughed madly, looking at Yulman. The flame that had been dancing on his palm suddenly grew to enormous proportions, and now the demon seemed to be burning within him. He spread his hands, controlling the flame, and said that this was the most powerful force left by the apostle, and that the guy was lucky, because he would be the first to die from such a force. The magician directed the flame forward, and it obediently obeyed its master. A destructive fire swept through the bodies of people lying on the ground. Aces breathlessly admired the apostle's strength. At that moment, Sylph appeared. She stood in front of Yulman and created a storm barrier with her magic. It helped for a short time. Her energy was able to hold back the fire of the underworld. The apostle shouted for the girl to take Sierra, and they left there. The sword spirit, holding the barrier, replied that her main mission was to protect the master. Suddenly, she felt a soft stroking on the top of her head, which had already become habitual. Yulman confidently ordered her not to worry because this light could not harm him. The girl looked at the apostle with admiration.